Hello. Oh, where works. Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is Jim Carafano. I oversee foreign and security policy here at the Heritage Foundation. I'm going to introduce our co-host Samira in just a second. I just want to say I really wish Prime Minister was here because I've waited my entire life to want to say howdy Modi. It just sounds, so I wanted to say it anyway. We've one of the real privileges of working on this issue for these years is the opportunity to partner with Samir and the Observer Research Foundation, which is absolutely world-class think tank, and it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever had to experience. And it's not just rewarding because they're incredible professionals and brilliant minds and creative thinkers and inspirational. But also, if you look about the kind of things that we've worked on and what's happened in the U.S.-India relationship the last year, I just think it's remarkable. I can't think of any other geopolitical accomplishment that mirrors this than watching the American-Indian relationship grow. And the only metaphor I can think of is really bad because I want to say Everest, which I do know is in Nepal and not in India. But it's like we're at the base camp, which is like no mean feat because that's like 20,000 feet, right? Which is really an incredible achievement. But there's still this peak ahead of us to climb, and it's not just about the U.S.-India strategic partnership. It's about what we can do for our peoples together to make their lives better, which is incredible, and what we can do for the world. India has become such a global force and a global vision, and we see new policies in the Middle East, Indian engagement in Africa, throughout the Indo-Pacific. It's just, India's time as a global actor has come, and in such a positive and constructive way. So these dialogues have always been remarkable for helping kind of pump that thing forward. So thank you all for participating. It's an extraordinary opportunity for us. We're really excited about where we go from here. And I just think the best days are ahead of us. And anytime I get to listen to Samir, I know my best times are ahead of me. So Samir, I'll turn it over to you. And again, thank you all for coming to the Heritage Foundation.
Good morning and welcome to this Heritage and ORF conversation on India-U.S. relationships. We've titled it India on the Hill. And it's not the hill in the sense of Everest, but it's actually hill in terms of Capitol Hill. And I think the reason is because over the years as ORF and Heritage have partnered and produced research, and by the way, we produce some really forward-looking documents together. 10 years ago, we did something on putting together a defense relationship, and everyone laughed at us. Today, we are $20 billion down that road. I think 9 years ago, we spoke about a quad and a triad and an India-U.S. joint maritime posture. Again, the Ministry of External Affairs came and gave a statement saying that this is not going to happen, and it happened. A few years ago, we spoke about the whole notion of the foundation agreements and India and U.S. pursuing those foundation agreements. They've happened. So I think this relationship, and Paul is here as well, and he's been a party to some of those conversations. I think every bold idea that we thought about in the last 20 years has materialized. And I think one of the reasons we are having this conference is because some of us believe we have stopped being bold in the relationship. I think we are enjoying the plateau and we need to shake the status quo. We need to disrupt our own sense of satisfaction being at the base camp and put in that extra energy to climb the peak. And in that sense, sitting in New Delhi at the Observer Research Foundation, we clearly believe in, and Mr. Joshi and others are going to speak about it in their panels, but I think there are three certainties for India as we look ahead. The first certainty is that the most important political and policy decisions that will implicate India's growth are going to be written outside New Delhi. It is going to be the decisions in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, in Beijing, and in other capitals, which are going to implicate our ability to grow, to maneuver, to prosper. And therefore, India will have to learn to engage with a whole new constituency of actors who are writing those political scripts and policy ideas. And when we say India will have to engage with these communities, it's not India a monolith. It is the vibrant communities in India, from the parliamentarians to the academia to government folks to industry, who will need to start dealing with their counterparts and with other constituencies. The second certainty, of course, is that the largest growth that India will experience in the next decade, the largest share of that growth is now going to be internationally linked. Opportunities lie outside India. And I think we will also have to, therefore, learn how to participate in international markets, in international businesses, with international businesses. And of course, learn how to become keen actors in what was earlier considered an externality in our decision-making processes. So what was external now is intimately internal, and India will have to understand that India's largest markets are outside India. That whole domestic-led growth model is beginning to hit the wall, as we can see in the current economic downturn. There are limits to how much India can buy its way to prosperity. We will have to create new models. The third certainty, of course, is, and we genuinely are beginning to put this together at the foundation and, of course, with partners such as the Heritage, is that the blueprint for the 21st century is yet to be written. I think the political architecture, the one that was devised post the big wars in the last century, has perhaps run its course. We need a new design, a new template for the digital age, for the data economy, for technology and the knowledge age, for the different and unique circumstances we experience today. And the question, therefore, that we need to ask ourselves is that, does India want to be sitting on the table, being part of the team that is writing that new blueprint, or do we still want to continue to be the leader of the global trade union, which is opposing the transitions that are bound to happen? And I think in that sense, the country that will be most important to us for all of these three realities that we are confronted with is going to be the United States of America. There is no political future that India would want which would not have the US as one of the most important interlocutors of the 21st century. There is no economic arrangement which will not see the India-US relationship being the most robust in India's future. And certainly there is no community which is more aligned to the way we experience the world as the communities that reside in this great country. So the ORF heritage relationship for the last 10 to 12 years has been pursuing lots of projects, research work, and events such as these, and convenings such as these, with three purposes. One is build a community of people who are invested in the idea of a stronger, robust India-US relationship, build research and research capabilities that help devise ideas for this future, and finally create a larger ecosystem where we can attract other countries and other communities to join our common cause. India on the Hill is actually about this relationship that we are trying to nurture. This is a pilot project, a test run this year. We are going to do this as an annual exercise. We have to be bold, we have to be audacious, we have to be grand, as we heard last night. Whichever way you spin the realities of today, like someone said, if this is the worst our relationship has seen for a while, I must tell you, and as Jeff said, we are in a very good shape. If this is the worst that we can be, I think we have done a lot to progress the relationship. I remember times when our relationships went down, there was no communication. We used to stop talking. That used to be the default mode. When we don't agree, stop talking, be petulant kids, and ignore each other. At the worst of our times today, we have a robust institutional architecture. We have individuals who are changing the status quo, and we have individuals such as Ambassador Shringla who are determined to help us climb the peak that James was mentioning. So I think if this is the worst of our times, I think we are a very strong bilateral relationship. And if we are at a plateau or at the base camp, as James describes it, I think we have a beautiful view of the peak, and we should all be climbing towards that. So I hope these 1.5 days helps us build that community, helps us build ideas, and helps us create a sense of commitment to a future that we both deserve, that we both need to work together and co-create. So thank you very much for joining us. Let me hand it back to Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you, James. Thank you to everybody in the audience and to the many watching from home on streaming. Thank you to Ambassador Shringla for being here for our panel this morning. And thank you to our first speaker, who I'm going to introduce very briefly because he has to get back to Capitol Hill soon. Congressman Ted Yoho, we've asked to come and give the opening address for this conference. We've been working with Ambassador Yoho, Representative Yoho for many years now. He's been to several heritage conferences to speak on Asia. He was the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Asia and Pacific Subcommittee. He's now the ranking member. So he has an intense interest in Indo-Pacific affairs, in India, in China, in Taiwan. He was formerly a small business owner who operated several animal veterinary practices in Florida. And he's been a member of the House of Representatives since 2012. And he's going to talk a little bit about how the India-U.S. relationship looks from his perspective and how we can help address challenges and seek out opportunities moving forward. After his brief remarks, we're going to start with a panel discussion of which Ambassador Shringla will be a part. And we're going to have really a robust morning of public sessions. And we're extremely excited here at Heritage to have our ORF partners, several distinguished speakers from India joining us today as panelists, as moderators, as keynote speakers. Extremely enthusiastic about this opportunity and look forward to taking things forward. So with that, I know we were on a bit of a deadline here, but Congressman Yoho, thank you so much for taking time out of your day.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's good to see you. It's not after lunch, so nobody's going to fall asleep. Thank you for allowing us to come here, and I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for hosting this conference to highlight the growing importance of a robust Indo-U.S. partnership, alliance, friendship, and all of the above. As ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific and Non-Proliferation, strengthening economic and diplomatic relationships between the United States and India is one of my top priorities. You know, when I got on foreign affairs, one of the things I wanted to do, and one of the things I saw was that foreign policy, good foreign policy, is good economic policy. Good foreign policy is good trade policy. But more importantly, good foreign policy is strong national security, not just for us, but with our partners. And what we're seeing is the world is always changing, and it will continue to change. But some things can be static, and I'll talk about that. India, as you know, is an important democratic ally to the United States, being the largest and us being the oldest. The ninth largest trading partner. The United States supports India's emergence as the leading global power, and India continues to serve as a key partner in spreading economic prosperity, democratic principles throughout the region and the world. And this is so vital today with the changing world, the flux that we're seeing going through the world with rising powers that are challenging the world status quo. We haven't seen this kind of, I guess it's a tectonic shift in world power since World War II that we've not seen before. Ambassador, great to see you. I failed to recognize you. I'm glad you're here in our relationship. The introduction of the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy in 2017 demonstrated the United States' renewed commitment to a strong and lasting relationship with India. The rise of India as a commercial powerhouse, and you are, and a democratic leader makes India an important player in achieving a free and open Indo-Pacific. And over the next decade and beyond, our two countries must work together to counter authoritarian aggression, encourage the free flow of trade, and protect freedom and liberties around the world. And I want to pivot back to what I was saying about the growing powers that are coming. And we're seeing challenges. We're seeing claims, false claims made to the South China Sea by a country that feels fit to take over and control those lanes. This is something that we need to work together. And I talk to our manufacturers over and over again, and they talk about the market in China, how important it is. It's 1.3 billion people. Yes, it is. But when you have a country that has cornered the market on rare earth metals, has threatened the flow of those, and they have to other countries. When you have a country that has cornered the market on the vitamin and minerals that go into our animal feed, when you have a country that has cornered the market on the ingredients that go into our pharmaceuticals, and then they have a anti-Western democracy tilt, it shows more important why our relationship with with the Indians, and our relationships are that much stronger. So I tell our manufacturers, you might want to think about an ABC policy for manufacturing, and that's manufacture anywhere but China. Go to India. Go somewhere else. Because I know that's a 1.3 billion market, but there's over 6 billion people over here. Let's focus on these. And that's where it's so strategic. And that's why I say good foreign policy is good economic, good trade policy, good national security, because we're all stronger in that. There are those in the world that want to disrupt the world, and I have learned in business, and I learned this, just running my veterinary practices, working with people. I got to where I did business with people I know, like, and trust. And I look at our relationship. We look at the diaspora in America of over 3 million Indians, Indian Americans, the strong work ethic, the strong family ties, the strong entrepreneurship. And I love the competition because the Indians are strong entrepreneurs, and they believe in capitalism and the things that it can reward to a society. India also has strong ties here in America, and our strong people-to-people ties will continue to strengthen as we promote our common values, rule of law, and democratic ideals. The one thing we know certain is change. It's inevitable. It's like water in a river. You can't stay still in the same spot without treading at least at the speed of the current. But some things must stay solid, and that is our relationship, our foundational principles, our values, our friendships, and the democratic values that we hold dearer that make that relationship stronger. And as we go into the next future, it is this generation that'll set the tone, that'll set the direction for the posterity of our two nations together. And I hope we focus on those things that make us stronger together, that unite us stronger together, and respect the independence of each nation as we move forward. And so with that, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you being here, our relationship, and I look forward to having further dialogues. I appreciate the Heritage Foundation for allowing me to come over, and you guys have a wonderful rest of your day and your seminar. Thank you. Good to see you.
Well, with that, I would like to invite the first panel to come on up. Lindsay, Ambassador Stringler, Sanjoy. I'm going to turn the floor over to Lindsay soon, our moderator. But this panel is titled India-U.S. Relations and the New Security Paradigm. And the security architecture of the extant international order is unable to keep pace with shifts in the balance of power. The 21st century will require new frameworks, institutions, and partnerships to maintain international security. As two powers with similar normative values and similar interests in multiple geographies, especially the Indo-Pacific, India and the U.S. are well placed to ideate and support a new international security framework. This panel will explore new avenues for cooperation between India and the U.S. and debate how best to avoid possible friction. It will ask how India and the U.S. can shape a new security order. And with that, we have a fantastic panel lineup for you here. We've asked Lindsay Ford to come and moderate the panel, but we have Ambassador Harsh Shringla, Indian Ambassador to the United States. We have Sanjoy Joshi from the Observer Research Foundation, and we have Major General Michael Minahan, Chief of Staff of Headquarters of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Lindsay, and hope you can get us started. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
So I want to say thanks to Jeff and to the Heritage Foundation, as well as ORF, for having me here today and for hosting a really important set of conversations with today's conference. There is obviously an exceptional group of speakers next to me. I am thrilled to be on the panel with them. And this panel is going to take on some big questions today, as Jeff said. What role the U.S.-India partnership is going to play in building up the kinds of institutions and partnerships and frameworks that we need in the future to have a stable international security order. These are big issues to tackle, but we couldn't have three better panelists than the ones sitting next to me. Just to say a couple of words about who we have joining me today. Ambassador Shringla is current Indian ambassador to the U.S. And am I correct in understanding the youngest? This is what I was told, the youngest diplomat to serve as Indian ambassador to the U.S. So
We'll have to go back to.
He's been working tirelessly to promote the U.S.-India relationship. No doubt has a busy weekend ahead of him. I have to say, as a former Texan, I give huge kudos to the Howdy Modi title. I liked that a lot. And the ambassador has had a long and really successful diplomatic career spanning over 35 years. He's held a variety of positions in Delhi, overseas, most recently as High Commissioner of India to Bangladesh and Ambassador of India to the Kingdom of Thailand. Next to me, we have Major General Michael Minahan, who's the Chief of Staff for U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. And as I believe my Indo-PACOM colleagues are fond of saying, the responsibilities stretch from Hollywood to Bollywood. Which is particularly appropriate for today's conversations. Indo-PACOM oversees U.S. Engagement, military engagement and presence in a vast region of the world, has an enormous set of responsibilities. General Minahan has decades of service, serving as an Air Force pilot and in a number of roles, including Chief of Staff for UN Command and U.S. forces in Seoul, South Korea, staff assignments at Headquarters Air Force, U.S. Transportation Command, and Pacific Air Forces. Then finally, but certainly not least, we have Sanjoy Joshi, the chairman of the Observer Research Foundation. He has a breadth of experience, in particular looking at Indian energy and environmental policies. He spent 25 years in India's administrative service, including serving as Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas. He's also the founding mission director for the Watershed Development Mission, and subsequently the managing director of the Renewable Energy Development Agency. So as you can see, there are a number of topics that our panelists can take on today. They're each going to speak for about 7 to 8 minutes, then we'll do some questions, and then hopefully we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So with that, we're going to get started. Should we start, Mr. Ambassador, with you?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Let me begin by thanking the Observer Research Foundation, in particular Samir Saran, and the Heritage Foundation, Jeff Smith, and others for hosting this very important and timely India on the Hill event. When we talk about the subject of today's conversation, the India-U.S. The new security paradigm, I think it'd be important to try and get a sense of where we are at this point of time and where we can go from here. And I'll try and do some of that. And of course, I'd be very interested in listening to the views of my other esteemed panelists who would have a lot of good suggestions to make in this regard. Now, in the India-U.S. Strategic partnership has emerged as one of the key bilateral relationships from the start of this century, and has the potential to become the defining partnership within this century. And of course, it was as early as 2000, the year 2000, that Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee said that India and the US were natural allies, and that the partnership was based on common interests. And more recently, in 2016, it was Prime Minister Modi who had said that both India and the US had overcome the hesitations of history in forging a partnership that was both important and strategic. Now, when you look at a partnership that emerges as a strategic one, and I think Congressman Ted Yoho referred to it as a tectonic shift, and I think that's, it really illustrates that it was a dramatic shift in a period of time that's relatively short. And to achieve a policy change of that nature, obviously you need not just a buy-in, but you need an active support and endorsement of the top leadership. And I think in this regard, we've been fortunate that successive US presidents and Indian prime ministers over the last 15 years or so have forged a close relationship, which is also in many cases based on personal chemistry between them. And of course, in the current instance, since Prime Minister Modi was re-elected in May this year, you've had Prime Minister Modi and President Trump meet twice. And later this week, when President Modi arrives in the United States, they're scheduled to meet twice more. So you'd have 4 meetings in the span of a few months. So it is really reflective of the nature of the relationship. But what we have done is that I think we've also created institutional mechanisms that allow the leaderships on both sides to meet. You've had, of course, we have both India and the US are members of the G20. We've institutionalized what is called the Japan, America, India, or JAE dialogue, the trilateral relationship at the summit level. If you add Australia to it, then you also have the Quad, which we are now looking forward to commencing at the level of foreign ministers. At the level that is more directly involved with the strategic partnership, you have the 2+2 dialogue, which is the level of foreign and defense ministers. You have a defense policy dialogue. You have a maritime security dialogue. So you have the different elements that would go into a regular and institutionalized framework of discussions on how to take the strategic partnership forward and to assess what you have achieved so far. And of course, if you look at the defense partnership, we have either concluded or are in the process of including most of the foundational agreements from LEMOA to COMCASA. We're making very good progress on BECA and the Industrial Security Annex. And of course, India has emerged as or rather, India is looking at the United States as also a major platform for its defense procurements and equipment and technology. We're also working jointly on research and development in many areas of technology that's relevant to both our countries. Now, on the defense side, of course, the US is a country with whom we have among the largest, most extensive military exercises. And this year, we are going to start with what is called a tri-service exercise involving all 3 services, which is going to focus on HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief side of things. And I think that would be a new trend in this regard. Besides that, of course, on the counter-terrorism and the security front, we have a joint working group on counter-terrorism. We have a designations dialogue, which jointly decides on individuals and entities to be designated either bilaterally or under the UN's 1267 list. And of course, we have a number of other, let's say, areas of cooperation. The building blocks of this strategic partnership, the security partnership that has emerged, is in place. Now, when you look at what really constitutes an area of cooperation, the focus has been on the Indo-Pacific. It's a vast area. You mentioned from Hollywood to Bollywood, and then we would prefer to extend that right up to the coast of East Africa, which encompasses also parts of, which encompasses the Gulf and the African continent. We are talking about a really vast region. And when you look at the Indo-Pacific, of course, it really means that countries that have shared values, principles, ideologies come together to define what you believe should be a region that you want to cooperate in and exist in, which is essentially common rules-based approach to international affairs, whether it is the rules governing the use of common spaces, or it is the transparency that is associated with connectivity, or any other areas of cooperation that you envisage in the region, including the settlement of disputes among states. But when you talk about the Indo-Pacific, what we find in India is that it really, to some extent, dovetails with what we have
what are existing concepts within our foreign and defense policy, which we are already really acting upon. And of course, the we have had for some time a neighborhood first policy, which really means that our neighbors are important and we want to focus on developing a relationship with our neighbors that is based on an inclusive approach, one that encompasses sharing of our development gains. When Prime Minister Modi talks of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, which means development for all, we don't mean that we confine this just to India, we confine it also to our neighbors. For example, the country where I was in as ambassador before coming here, Bangladesh, is a country in which we have allocated up to $10 billion in lines of credit and grants and aid, which has really, to some extent, helped that country achieve today close to 8% growth. And Bangladesh has become an important partner in many of the areas that we work together with all our neighbors on. So neighborhood first is one of the existing areas of our policy framework when we deal with countries in our neighborhood. There is the Act East policy, which really means that your neighbors to the east of you, which really means the ASEAN countries right up to Japan, are your important partners, and you need to co-opt them in anything that you want to achieve in your extended neighborhood. And even within the Indo-Pacific concept, when we talk about a free, open, transparent, inclusive Indo-Pacific, we really look at ASEAN as being the central point in that outreach effort. And of course, all of this is really encompassed in the larger concept of security and growth for all, which we call SAGAR, which is really a cooperation that is based on respect for all, dialogue, cooperation, peace, and prosperity. These are the principles on which we operate. And of course, in that context, I just want to mention a few brief words because I know that time is short, is that our approach to our neighborhood, which is our extended neighborhood, has been always based on, to some extent, on very close cooperation. And how do we achieve that cooperation? One of those is, of course, as in the security and strategic framework, as being first responders and net security providers. And I'll explain that a little bit. When you talk about first responders, we exist in an area which is prone to natural calamities. There are very frequent occurrences, and I'd, of course, give you the example of a very fairly serious earthquake that occurred in the Sulawesi province of Indonesia last year, in which our aircraft were the first to respond with relief equipment in Indonesia. Earlier this year in April, Mozambique suffered from very heavy cyclones. Again, our naval ships were there to provide assistance. When the Maldives ran out of water, our ships were there with drinking water. When Sri Lanka had an issue, again with the cyclone, our ships were there. Bangladesh had to deal with an influx of close to 400,000 refugees from the Rakhine state of Myanmar. It was a humanitarian disaster in the making. Our aircraft were there within a few days. And I must say that here, the recent acquisition of a heavy lift capacity that we had from the United States in the form of the C-17 Globemaster came in as a very, very useful instrument of that delivery of assistance. So first responders really means that you're there for your friends, your neighbors, your partners, and that when disaster strikes, difficult times happens, then we are available. The concept of a net security provider is, again, in the same mode. We work with our neighbors and partners to ensure that shipping lanes are free of piracy, so counter-piracy, counter-terrorism, but also cooperation in the form of white shipping, AIS systems, cooperation in the form of dealing with our partners on marine pollution, in areas that all our friends are comfortable with, right from Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, down to Mozambique and countries in the Gulf. So, and we've forged very good partnerships in the Indian Ocean region with Seychelles and Mauritius, at the same time with Sri Lanka and Maldives, and on the Bay of Bengal with Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand. With all of these countries, we have coordinated patrols, we have search and rescue, and we have joint search and rescue, and I think we have develop mechanisms by which we cooperate. Our navies cooperate very, very fruitfully on areas that help both countries. There is a mutuality of benefit here. And when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, we look at really extending the same positivity with our friends, with the United States, with Japan, with our other partners in extending this outreach in a cooperative manner that could include and co-opt as many countries in this larger concept of what we believe should be a region of shared security and growth and shared prosperity and development for countries in the area. And I think the success of the Indo-Pacific and the success of a larger strategic partnership lies in an approach that involves and includes, incorporates as many of our partners and friends within this region and beyond as possible. I'll stop there because I know that you have a time constraint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. General Minahan, can I turn to you?
Absolutely. I agree with everything he just said.
Easy.
I'm going to save a little time here. First of all, good morning. My name is Mike Minahan. It's an honor to be here. All my operational experiences in the sand in the Middle East and all my staff experiences in the Pacific. So I've done 2 tours in Korea. I started out at Pacific Air Forces, and then this is my second time at Indo-PACOM. But when I went to Korea and came back, the name of PACOM had changed. I think it's an acknowledgement of the importance of this relationship in addition to the geography. Ambassador, I don't think I can explain it any better than you. Dr. Barry over there is my handler, and he actually has electrocution things hooked up to me if I go wrong. He told me very clearly last week, stick to the script, and that's exactly what I'm not going to do right now. If he stands up and says what the general meant to say, then you'll just have to forgive me a little bit. But to save some time and just to accentuate, I thought what the ambassador expressed very well in the military domain. When you start out with our shared values and principles that only 2 large liberal democracies can have, that is an enormous foundation from which to build. You add in the commitment by 2 countries to a free and open Indo-Pacific. All the dialogues the ambassador discussed, the multitude of agreements that add to the strength of that foundation, from the original GSOMIA to the 2+2 COMCASA, to the LAMOA, to the BECA, and hopefully more. You lay the platforms on top of those agreements, which in the military realm provide enormous connectivity and sense of common purpose when you are operating P-8s together and Apaches together and C-17s together and C-130s together and CH-47s together and Sea Guardians together and the H-60s. You just have a commonality that will bring not only a sense of purpose, but a understanding and a friendship and partnership that's just extremely strong and very meaningful in the military realm. Add on top of that a sense of, as the ambassador described, outreach, whether it's just the free and open Indo-Pacific or, as he described, being first responders. I had the honor in 2015 to lead the air component response to the Nepal earthquake out of Utapao, Thailand. And we relied heavily on the Indian Armed Forces, not only that C-17 capability, but the ability to push a combined alliance of air power up into Nepal to do that initial responding. Those initial first responder, whether you're in a Hatter response or a counter-terrorism response or a search and rescue response, like for the Malaysian airliner, that familiarity of platform, but also the working level, ability to command and control, to truly integrate, coordinate, understand each other's capabilities, and provide that much-needed effort can only come with routine operations, patrols, and operating together. I don't think any of the challenges that were described last night or today are unique to the U.S.-India relationship. The closest of friends, the closest of partners always have challenges that we have to work through. I came from Korea. We've been sitting in the same desk side by side for many years, and I can tell you that the challenges there are present, but they are things that are worked through regardless of who's in power, regardless of what the external pressures are. that military foundation of relationship teams tends to be very stable and accommodating when it comes to still handling all those challenges. So I thought there were two, and Chatham House rules last night, so non-attributable, but there are two great questions that came up that I'll just leave as I transition. One is, it was out of a different context, but what's next? So we talked about the agreements, we talked about the dialogues, and we talked about the platforms. What's next? I think that's a fair question. And then one that was also brought out last night was, what does it mean to be a major defense partner? So I look forward to the dialogue later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Joshi, can I turn to you?
Thank you, Lindsay. It's always been a pleasure being at the Heritage Foundation. I've been coming here, I think, ever since I joined ORF, which has now been 10 years. And I don't think there's been any single year in these 10 years when I've not been at the Heritage Foundation. So thank you for being such great hosts and having us ORF back in these portals time and again. We've had such excellent presentations that I think we can just open the floor up for questions. So I will just very briefly take forward some of the ideas which have been put on the table by Ambassador Shringla and General Minihan. When we start talking about the strategic relationship between the US and India, I mean, it's commonly we talk of the three things which get us together. The first is the nature of our political value systems, which bring us together. Second is, of course, the growth trajectory of India, India becoming a $5 trillion economy, then a $10 trillion economy over the next 10, 15, 20 years, and that economic partnership, which is at the core of this relationship. But third and most important, which is something Ambassador Shringla hinted at and spoke about, has been the larger evolving geomatrix, matrix as in the movie Matrix, which has been responsible for bringing these two countries together over the turn of the century. Around the time when the century turned, the whole focus of the world, the attention of the world came to be riveted upon this one region of the world, which was the Indo-Pacific. There were transformations happening. And that is one of the reasons why, in spite of the very acrimonious relationships which India and the US had post-Pokhran II, when India was slapped under sanctions, it took just not even 10 years for us to reach a stage where we went into 2005 and concluded the US-India Defense Partnership, which ultimately led to the 123 agreement, which was an exceptional agreement, which came to be called the Civil Nuclear Deal. This happened within 10 years of Pokhran. Now, these were some of the remarkable shifts which were happening around the world. And that was a reason why successive administrations, we are both very cantankerous democracies. We fight within ourselves all the time. And that is actually what is also common between us. But in spite of all that, in spite of who came and who went, this was a relationship which went on and has been moving on and gathering steam over the years through successive administrations. So let me just briefly talk about this, the unfolding geometrics, which actually brings us together and what has brought us together. Yes, the Indo-Pacific, and very commonly it has been described within this geometrics when we talk of the Indo-Pacific. There are convergences and divergences. Let us accept it. And there will always be, what we have between us is not a hackneyed Hollywood romance or a Bollywood romance. No, it is the theater of the Indo-Pacific is a complex theater. It is the drama which is being played out has got various plots and various subplots. And because of that, there are going to be divergences, there are going to be convergences. And yes, we need to talk about them and discuss about them. And the convergences, we talk about the divergences, Ambassador Shringla just briefly hinted at. From the US definition of the Indo-Pacific, from Hollywood to Bollywood, there's a problem. Because the influence of Bollywood, unfortunately, does not stop on India's western shores. Bollywood is very popular in West Asia. It penetrates deep into Africa. The three Khans are household names in every Moroccan home. They are known there. So India keeps on looking at its Western starboard, and when we talk about India's Act East policy, the Act East policy is part and parcel of India's Western engagement. It is part and parcel of it. And that is something which needs to be understood. And that is often what does, yes, lead to divergences. So when we start talking about India's Western arc and we start talking about how it is not distinct from its Act East policy, the fundamental fact is that there is in Asia, when we talk about this larger drama unfolding in Asia, what is this larger drama unfolding? As far as India is concerned, there is a project of the integration of Africa, Eurasia, and Asia at work. There's a large project at work out there. And from where we sit, it is our very, very clear perception that this project of integration cannot be. It cannot be a China-centric project tied by the BRI. So there are differences there. BRI, yes, can be one of the projects. It can be part of the matrix, but it cannot be exclusively the single matrix that operates here. So we believe that this has to be a far more diverse project, as diverse as these three continents themselves are. It has to be diverse, it has to be bottom-up, there have to be many more players in the game. And therefore, India, sitting where it does, is in the process of building partnerships which cobble together these coalitions, these arrangements, which make for a much more diverse arrangement of integration. And why that is necessary, you see, over the next few decades, there is this very important need to lay down the infrastructure networks, the digital highways that will power the growth of the 21st century. And that is going to happen in this region, that is happening across this region. That involves the reformulation and reconfiguration of the global China-centric value chains, which have dominated the world in the last 2 decades. The changes in these value chains are being demanded by 3 things. Now, first of all, the changes in these value chains are being demanded by the shifting demographics of this region. The way these countries are growing, the way the demographics are shifting, the way the demand, where the largest concentration of youth lies in the world, it is here. Second, they're being demanded by the trade disparities that have led to the current trade wars. That's the second thing which is demanding that these value chains be reconfigured. And third, they're going to be shaped by the very different modes of manufacturing that are going to be put in place by the 4th industrial revolution. That is another major shift which is going to be happening over the next few years. And all 3 are demanding the reconfiguration of these value chains. So these are responsible for India's engagements on its western starboard, whether these engagements are with Iran, whether these engagements are with Russia. They are a very important part of this matrix which has to be evolving over the next few years. So therefore, there are 3 things in brief, let me just conclude, which the US and India need to do. Now, first, we need to share and appreciate an assessment of the new emerging security geographies. And yes, there will be differences in perceptions there, but we need to share it, understand it, because there is, I fundamentally see, a much larger convergence at work here in our visualizations and definition of the Indo-Pacific, and not just of the Indo-Pacific, of Afro-Eurasia, and going forward, even of how the Arctic unfolds. Second, where our mental maps and our strategic conceptualizations over the shared space do not converge, the US will need to cede policy space to India and not be the veto power it has been in its alliances, both with the EU and in East Asia. Whether it is the US relationship with Pakistan, where India has no ambition of controlling this relationship and does not want to control this relationship, or then of India's strategic relationships with Russia and Iran, where it will continue to seek adequate space from the United States. And third and lastly, as India and the US work to develop a shared security engagement, which means serving a rules-based order, one that accommodates the foreign policy interests of both sides, they will need to look at a defense partnership that moves beyond just counting the defense sales numbers of $18 billion, $19 billion, and $20 billion. It needs to move beyond that. The real opportunity and challenge actually lies in creating a joint Indo-U.S. military industrial architecture capable of integrating U.S. and Indian supply chains together. And not just U.S. and Indian supply chains, these supply chains across other like-minded countries across the world. Now, that is what we need to move towards. And for instance, you have the joint venture between Tata and Lockheed Martin. You need to have multiple of these, a lot of these coming into place. So, and I think, whereas blunt instruments like the CATSA do not work, the US designation of India as a major defense partner allows for the operationalization of these objectives, which I talked about, because it creates an exceptional architecture for a unique partnership with India. The leadership somehow, beyond the bureaucracies which get stuck in the trade skirmishes and niggling at the WTO, it keeps getting stuck and gets desperate about these things. The larger architecture of this relationship seems to be falling into place with an arrangement which sees that there is the need for flexibility in this institutional arrangement. And that is why the MDP has been an extremely important step in moving this forward. See, ultimately, yes, we are both democracies. Our political landscape will constantly change, and our societies and people, the fact is, continue to derive their energy, their creativity, and their constant ability to reinvent themselves from this flux and change. That is our strength. It is not our weakness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to get started on some questions, and actually I'm going to first pose a question to all three of our panelists. So we heard a lot of discussion about the tremendous growth in the U.S.-India bilateral partnership over the last decade, and the degree to which there's a lot of strategic alignment between our countries. Not just based on our common values as large democracies, but also a growing sense of shared interests. And I think that here in particular, one area where there has been particular convergence in strategic viewpoints between the United States and India in recent years is obviously how to address China's growth in the region. However, when we talk about great power relationships, the US and India may have slightly different viewpoints on how we approach Russia. So I'd like to ask everyone if you could just comment your thoughts on where the US and India are aligned and maybe where we have divergences and how we think about great power relations and how we work through some of those divergences. Who'd like to start?
I think I already spoke about, when I spoke of the divergences. India and Russia, yes, have had a long-standing relationship. And that was a relationship which developed during the days of the Cold War. There is a history behind it. There's also a history behind how India's economic architecture, its entire industrial infrastructure was built up with Russian help. That is one part of it. But moving beyond the Cold War, post the Cold War era, there has been this other very, very strong shifting dynamic developing between the Asian powers, between China, Russia, and India, where India needs to play a part between the growing relationship which has started emerging between Russia and China. And India can play an important balancing part. That is why you had the Prime Minister recently going to Vladivostok. And we had a number of arrangements signed with the Russians. This is an important relationship which, for the sake of Asia, which for the larger project which I talked about, which is ultimately Africa, Europe, and Asia, getting integrated together through very different and diverse projects which has been happening. There is skin in the game for everybody in this. There is skin in the game also for the United States of America in this. And this is precisely where, I see this as a complementarity. I see this as a foil. India's relationships in Asia are actually that foil which can make that critical difference to step in many ways, where the US cannot, with very different kinds of relationships. These are important for the US also, and they're equally important for India.
Excellent. General Minahan, Mr. Ambassador.
I think that shared values, rules-based order, free and open Indo-Pacific is all the guidance I need. And that anything that challenges access to the global commons, sea, air, maritime, space, cyberspace, would fall into what would be a subset of the greater alignment. So there's no mistake. You can go to SecDef's comments at Newport last week that China is the big challenge, and that there is a challenge that there is friction between their goals and our shared interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific to all of those domains. So I see enough in the grand vision that gives Indo-PACOM and the mill-to-mill relationship all it needs for the alignment.
Well, I think I really would agree with both panelists. You're coming from different points of view, but the fact of the matter is that when you talk about a strategic, let's say, environment in which you have developed a very strong partnership with the United States in a very short period of time, it really is something that both countries should see mutual benefit from and are seeing mutual benefit. At the same time, what we are not really looking at is a relationship that would be mutually exclusive as far as your other partners are concerned. In other words, while this relationship, which is based on shared values and principles, will continue to grow and develop and prosper, as far as India is concerned, it is also important for us to keep open the channels of communication that have traditionally existed. In the case of Russia, of course, it comes from before the Cold War. And it also really is an important aspect of our current security preparedness as well. And after all, a vast amount of our defense platforms are Russian. We hold a very large inventory of spares, which is Russian, and we can't simply overlook those factors. I don't know what the rules, is it Chatham House rules that exist here? Or
No.
is it, it isn't. Okay. So maybe I should stop there.
Okay.
So
Fair enough.
What I'm just to conclude, what we're talking about really is that and what Mr. Joshi said was that it really is something that shouldn't be seen in that context either, because the relationships that we have with China and with Russia are those that could also be of let's say some benefit to the United States in ways that are not always tangible. With China, it's a more complicated relationship because they're a neighbor of ours. They're an immediate neighbor. We have common borders. And what we really believe is that it's important that there is an engagement and that we're not looking at a situation which is necessarily in any way confrontational, but an engagement that could, in some senses, derive benefits from areas like trade. The United States has a strong trade relationship with China. It's of course, both the US and we would like to recalibrate it because we do believe that the current levels of trade are not sustainable in terms of the adverse balances. India also has a very significant adverse trade balance with China, and one of our major planks of engagement with China is to try and address that issue. But also the issue of on the other hand, of technology, and what is technology that is not just appropriate and reasonable, but also in terms of what are your larger security interests and where this technology could fit in, or where you need to be, looking at it and reviewing that. So these are complex issues, and One of the issues that comes up very often is our defense partnership with Russia. Fact of the matter is that as our relationship with the United States grows as a major defense partner, we have really seen a spike in that area of cooperation. And this cuts across all areas of cooperation. It's not just procurement, as Mr. Joshi pointed out, but it encompasses training, it encompasses joint exercises, it encompasses working together on HADR activities, vast range in joint research and development that is happening. And at the same time, I think we can't overlook a factor of a certain level of dependency on Russian platforms, which is also essential and sometimes absolutely necessary for our security preparedness, which we believe the United States should be understanding of. As a strategic partner, it also means understanding of your partners' engagements, which are essential for their own security and existential requirements. So I'll just stop there and we'll see how we can.
Thank you very much. General Minahan, I want to follow up on the question of the defense relationship for a minute. We heard a litany of really significant achievements that have been made in the bilateral U.S.-India relationship over the past several years. But I want to ask also, a priority for the United States has been not just to enhance its bilateral relationships, but to think about how to perhaps better network some of our defense relationships together. Obviously, the topic of the Quad has gotten a lot of attention, but there's also a lot of progress being made between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia at trilateral levels as well in the defense relationships. So what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities for further strengthening some of those multilateral defense networks as well?
Well, I think as described specifically with your earlier China question is there's enough challenge out there that no one country can ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific without extreme amount of partnerships, allies, and multilateral. So there is a network of allies, mutual defense treaties that exist throughout the Indo-PACOM AOR. India is a partnership, a strong partnership, and that needs to exist in a multilateral nature. So you described Australia, Japan, Philippines, I would throw in there. Any like-minded nation that has a vested interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific, that believes in rule-based order, that believes in access to the global commons, I think there is room in the security architecture, whatever you call it, but partnership and multilat is wonderful, that there is a need to operationalize those relationships mill-to-mill with joint sales or HADR or counter-terrorism or information sharing or imagery sharing. All that, I think, is where Indo-PACOM is putting its focus in. It's foundational to the approach that Indo-PACOM is taking. There is the partnership, partners and allies is one of the four core tenets of what Admiral Davidson is focusing on. And I see the India relationship as center to that as we move forward.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ambassador, a topic that you brought up, we've been talking a lot about security. One thing that is equally important when we think about shared security is the idea of our economic security as well. U.S.-India bilateral trade has grown phenomenally over the past decade. I think annual bilateral goods and services trade has doubled in the last decade. We've had some bumps perhaps in the road in recent months, and now perhaps maybe seeing some light at the end of the tunnel here. So could you talk to me about what you see as some of the biggest priorities and opportunities when we think about how to enhance the U.S.-India economic partnership?
Well, for any economic relationship that has developed so quickly, and as you say, our trade has doubled in the last 10 years, and potentially can double again in the next 5 years. We're looking at $280 billion in the next 5 years. And also very significant two-way investments. And US companies have invested significantly in India. But interestingly, Indian companies have also invested significantly in the United States, creating value, creating jobs. And I think that's an important factor because this is a two-way exchange. So there is a mutuality of interest and benefit in that economic partnership that we're talking about. And there are other factors to it, like technology, access to technology. Prime Minister Modi did say that the US is India's partner of choice when it comes to our socioeconomic transformation through our flagship initiatives and schemes. And so when it comes to trade, investments, technology, the US is among our foremost partners and one that we have, I think, really both countries have benefited from. But when you have such a relationship that has developed so fast, you're bound to have certain issues that come up at the policy realm, at the realm of market access and so on and so forth, and that is what we're dealing with today. And I think these are not necessarily issues that are significant enough to impact on the larger relationship. I have described them as minor speed bumps as you come along the way. And I think we will be vindicated in that because both our respective authorities that deal with these issues are in close contact. As we speak, they are in touch in trying to see how we can address some of the issues that are there. Some will need a little more time, but there are others that can be, I think, resolved more quickly. And I think we're looking at how we can prioritize those and move forward. So I have no doubt that we will see not only a speedy resolution of some of the issues that constitute trade differences between our sides, and also on the issue of investment policy. We have taken an approach that emphasizes continued liberalization for our investment regime. And recent steps that have been taken really also point in that direction of liberalizing the insurance sector, the civil aviation sector, the media sector, and sectors that matter in terms of single brand retail to US companies that have invested in India. And I think that will also see a significant change. And we are also looking at other policy changes that could assist in a greater involvement of US companies in India and vice versa. So take the case of Indian involvement in the United States. Last year, we, for the first time, purchased $4.5 billion of oil and gas from the United States. President Trump, in a State of the Union address, said that the United States had emerged for the first time as a net exporter of energy. And we are an important partner in that regard. This year, that could be taken up we could double that level. We are also looking at significant investments in the energy sector in the United States. So we become partners in the energy sector. In the next few decades, 25% of total growth in the energy sector would be accounted for by India. So we are major consumers of energy. The United States is now a major net exporter of energy. We have to see how best to capitalize on those interests and take it forward. This is one of the reasons why the Prime Minister would be meeting the top 15 CEOs of the energy sector in Houston, which is the global energy hub. And I think all of this augurs well for a relationship that is based, as I said, on a mutuality of benefit.
Thank you very much. Speaking of energy relationships, Mr. Joshi, my last question comes over to you. You, in your remarks, referenced West Asia, which, for those of us in the United States, we usually know as the Middle East. But I think speaks to perhaps different conceptions of how we think about the Indo-Pacific region. India has growing ties in West Asia, and a lot of that reflects India's own increasing security needs. As we're looking at a moment where there is growing instability in the Middle East and in the Gulf region right now, where do you see the U.S. and India as being aligned or not in how we approach that part of the world? And are there opportunities for greater bilateral cooperation there between the U.S. and India?
I think as far as the question of energy supplies are concerned, India and the US are both on the same page. There can be absolutely no divergence between it. We are committed to ensuring that energy supplies stay constant. And there is constant growth in energy supplies. Prices are kept at reasonable levels. And we are absolutely, India's economy is impacted extremely severely every time the price of oil spikes. You could see India's markets crash, hugely the day oil prices shot up by 14 to 15% in a single day after the attack on Saudi Aramco's refineries in the U.S. So therefore, maintaining supplies from West Asia, and that is one of the reasons why India has built very strong relationships with its core energy suppliers, which includes Saudi Arabia, which incidentally is also in the past included Iran. So, and the United States of America, as it emerges as a big exporter of both oil and gas, is definitely one of the strong partners which India looks forward to seeing in the future. But there's a bigger cooperation actually going on because, as you see, the energy game is changing. The energy markets are shifting. There's much more happening beneath the surface in the energy space, where there is potential for a far deeper relationship between the US and India. And I'm talking about new technologies. I'm not just talking about new technologies in renewables. I'm also talking about new technologies in modular liquefied natural gas, which are under development. I'm talking about new technologies developing in modular nuclear, which the US is a leader of, and which are going to be core for India and a lot of other countries like India in the next 10, 15, 25 years. So there is in the energy space a huge amount of vacant space, which both countries can step into in the next few years.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to turn the floor over for questions from all of you for a while. If you could raise your hand, and then do we have someone with a microphone? Right there, perfect. And if I could ask folks to identify yourself, and also if you could frame your remarks in the form of a question and not a comment, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, we have a question in the back.
Yeah. Good morning, General. My question is to you. I'm Javeer Sherigal, a spokesperson of a political party in India. Admiral Davidson spoke at the Raisina Dialogue this year, and he spoke about Indo-Pacific free trade and importance of Quad. But subject to factual correction, I believe is in Singapore and on March 6th or 7th for a conference on Quad. And he made a statement that he spoke to his India counterpart, and Quad actually may be shelved because there is no real potential there, and he attributed that to Admiral Sunil Lamba. So you think Quad is more of a stillborn child, or because of the deep diversity, there is a real threat to it?
I'm unfamiliar of the comments that you referenced. So, so I think I'll give you an unsatisfying answer, but I'll go back to the one I already gave. There is a place for multilateralism to deal with the challenges of this AOR. So it doesn't matter to me if you call it a quad or a trilat or a multilat or a bilat, that the need for like-minded nations to come together to handle the challenges is going to be a need that's never satisfied. So there's plenty of work to be done. I think that when you look at the nations of the Quad, there's a lot of similarities. So it's hard for me to believe that there's not a future, but that's at a much higher level than me. For militaries that need to work together, it's not hard to imagine multiple scenarios where that multilat team will have to get together and handle a mission. So I hope the way you describe it isn't true, and that there is a way forward for that.
Maybe I could address the last question. I believe there was some confusion in the conversation because the commander was asked about a naval quad and whether one exists. And as of right now, there's not a naval component. There's not an India, Australia, Japan, U.S. Quadrilateral exercise taking place. I think that's what he was referencing, and somehow the remarks got blown up to mean the quadrilateral strategic dialogue, which we are holding, which is very much alive, which many of us do find very important. So actually my question would be to Ambassador Shringla and Mr. Joshi. What do you see as the most important multilateral security forums and dialogues now. You know, many people believe that the India-U.S.-Japan trilateral strategic dialogue has been one of the best places to advance security cooperation at a robust pace, maybe more so than the Quad, and through bilateral avenues. So where are the best mechanisms now? Where should we be putting our energy and attention? Is it at the bilateral? Is it at the trilateral? Do we need more multilateral security dialogues? Are we content with building upon what's already there? Or do we need to be adding new layers to this matrix? Thank you.
Well, as far as India is concerned, we've had traditionally a number of, beyond bilateral relationships, what we call plurilateral, let's say, arrangements. And these are in many senses, interlocking and overlapping. In other words, you could be a member of the BRICS, that's, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And at the same time, you could be a member of, say, the Japan, America, India cooperation, or you could be a member of the Russia, India, China cooperation, or India, Brazil, South Africa. And, these countries in many senses are, present in one form or the other in some of these arrangements. Now, as far as the Japan, America, India trilateral is concerned, or even the concept of the Quad, these are really new and emerging arrangements. We've had 2 meetings of the Japan, America, India trilateral summits in Buenos Aires and in Osaka. And I think the idea is that these summits would be held every time there's a G20 meeting in the margins of those meetings. So this is an emerging concept and one that needs much more, I would say, regularity before they emerge further from it. The Quad at this point of time has been at the DG level, and as you call it, it's a strategic interface at the DG level, and again one that really needs more time to come and to and take a shape of its own. And so these are emerging concepts that are need to be fleshed out further, need to be taken further. And I'm sure they would find a certain sort of reasoning and justification for a larger and more expanded sort of, involvement. Now, whether we should go in for other such formats is really between us. I think the U.S.-India partnership has always been based on a strong bilateral construct. And that bilateral construct today, I think, is in a position where we can reach out and incorporate other partners that come into our, let's say, into this arrangement. I mean, Japan is one that enjoys close relations with both India and the United States, and therefore is a natural partner that you would co-opt into any arrangement that involves countries cooperating together, talking to each other. And what we're doing today is really talking to each other. And that is what we should be doing. We should be having our leaders talk to each other. We should be having our officials talk to each other, and then thereby creating the basis for a larger cooperative arrangement that could be, as I said, to the mutual benefit of all countries concerned. So these arrangements are really areas where you come together, you exchange views, and most of these plurilateral arrangements, and I mentioned a few of them, are not outcome-based. They're really, arrangements whereby the leaders and others from these countries can come together and talk about and exchange views on various issues. And I think that itself is a very helpful thing. If you are talking to leaders from countries that have a certain partnership with you at the bilateral level, you come together and you talk at regional levels, it I think clears a lot of, first of all, enables you to look at what you're respectively doing. And if there are any differences, those can be aired out. And you can also look at where you can cooperate. So they're helpful arrangements as we see them. But I think Mr. Joshi might want to add more to that from...
I'd just like to add this little bit that, so far, one of the fundamental, I'll go back to what the keynote speaker tried to say this morning, that a sound, secure relationship actually needs to have very strong economic underpinnings. And a weakness of the Quad strategy in the past had been that it only had a security architecture. It lacked a more comprehensive economic architecture, which would become the base of that bigger security architecture. I keep speaking about the changing matrix and what has been happening in the continent. For the Quad to move forward, there has to be a very strong architecture that lays down what the people on the ground need. And the fundamental things where people on the ground are crying out for are jobs and infrastructure. That is the need, that is the demand. Now, those postures have been changing within members of the Quad, which is a good sign. And these have been happening bilaterally. These have been happening plurilaterally. And there is a gradual shift happening when India and Japan meet, when India and South Korea meet, when India and ASEAN meet. A lot of these issues are getting discussed, and they are not just bilateral projects which are getting discussed. What are getting discussed are larger projects. For example, before the sanctions kicked in on Iran, there was discussion, deep discussions between India and Japan on what to do with the INSTC, how the INSTC should moving ahead. There have been core discussions on how investments in Africa should proceed, how should they move forward. So what you are seeing is, bit by bit, it's a very complex jigsaw puzzle. The pieces, we are not doing a top-down centralized model like the BRI, but the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are being put up bottom-up, slowly, bit by bit, and that's what we need to do. So you are going to need multiple such arrangements, and you need to have many such conversations in many forums at various levels.
Thank you. There are questions in the front?
Good morning. My name is Prasad Kadambi. I'm a nuclear safety consultant in civil nuclear power. Mr. Joshi, could you elaborate on what you said about small modular reactors and cooperation in the nuclear space? Because my biggest interest is getting some forward movement on the US-India nuclear deal and its promise of growth in the technology overall.
See, I'm at the moment speaking about technologies, and I'm speaking about the way ahead, because the single largest roadblock in development of nuclear plants, large nuclear power plants, has been this problem of not in my backyard. And wherever you try to put up these large nuclear power plants, there are always protests which keep on arising because of this issue. So there have been various companies across the world working on commercializing modular technologies in nuclear, which is, and not just nuclear, I'm also here talking about in liquefied natural gas, small modular units where you decentralize the kind of energy production which takes place rather than concentrated in one area. So you can have small scale both nuclear plants, LNG-fired plants. Many of these technologies are in the process of being commercialized. Some licenses, 1 or 2 licenses have been given out in the US. It is a very, very, I would say, fledgling field developing, but I see great future for it.
Thank you.
My name is Raju Kusregar. I have a question for Major Midian. The defense assets require, cohesion and communication across, and I think you sort of alluded to it. But you also heard this, the issue about having other disparate hardware from other countries. It worked very well for, in the NATO environment so far, but now there's another NATO ally, Turkey, which also has a different hardware. So how would you handle it logistically?
Yeah. The challenges of equipment talking to each other are not unique to partners and allies. There's enormous challenges within the U.S. just amongst the services too. So, a lot of it speaks to not just where you buy your where your equipment is made, but also when it was bought, right? You know, that there's always, especially with the leading edge military technology, you know, it's very expensive and hard to replace and keep up with the modern technology. So I would answer, I can't comment on the NATO piece, but I would answer this, that when it comes to integrating military forces, it's as much about systems being able to talk as it is about standards and protocols and just procedures. So there are ways that we can be interoperable with equipment that is not the same. But in this case, we have a lot of opportunity to have a lot of commonality, and I think that we should build on that. That doesn't mean everything and every piece of equipment can or platform can do that. But certainly in a modern sense, there's a foundation of commonality that's very good and pretty unique in the AOR as well. So, you know, like I described earlier, it's not limited to just the relationship between the U.S. and India, but these exist within the U.S. Armed Forces and also with all our partners and allies. So, but the one thing that brings us together is operating, as the ambassador described, in a joint and combined environment routinely to make those operations complex, so that by the time you are operating on a real mission, that you have those standards and protocols that ensure that that connectivity is there.
Thank you, General. Additional questions? In the back.
Tanvi Balan from Brookings. I wonder if all of you could lay out a vision for where you see US-India relations in an ideal world 10 years from now, in terms of the security partnership, the economic one, but even beyond that. Sanjay talked about the energy partnership. But are there some concrete kind of, not deliverables as such, but could you give us that vision of what you'd like to see 10 years from now?
Tanvi likes to ask easy questions.
No.
Well, I'll tell you how we see a strategic partnership. Our strategic partnership with the United States is not really looking at it from a short-term perspective, and I think you alluded to that when you talked about 10 years, but we're looking at it several years down the line. It has to be seen as a long-term partnership. It should not be seen in the prism of 4 or 5 years. In other words, within the realm of normal governments that are part of the democratic process of both our countries. It's important that a strategic partnership is regarded in a long-term perspective and one that you could plan for accordingly. And that sort of prospective planning and a clear outline of how you see this evolving is something that both countries have been attempting to work at. When you talk about the major defense partnership, and it is the major defense partnership because the United States doesn't have any other major defense partner, what defines a major defense partnership? What are the elements of that, and how do we use that, to create some sort of a stepping stone over the next 10, 20, or 25 years? And that's, I think, still in the making. How would you like to see it is something that I think I will leave to both Mr. Joshi and General Manian to try and outline for us.
Well, to Tanvi's easy question, I have an easy answer. If you talk about a long-term relationship, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line, you're looking at a US-India partnership that works not just for the US and India, but it works for the larger global architecture, which means that when you start talking of a rules-based framework prevailing, the rebuilding of multilateral institutions across the world, the rebuilding of multilateral arrangements which are rules-based, that is what India and the US as countries with deep shared values belong. And that is what they should be working towards. That is one of the deliverables which we should be working towards. And I really feel that our divergences in this, in the entire relationship which we have at the moment, are in the long run actually convergences. And we are, in very different ways, going to be working towards the same goals.
I want to see a depth of operations beyond dialogues, agreements, and platforms. I want to see familiarity and interoperability. I want to see an ability to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific in the fullest extent of Indo and the fullest extent of Pacific. And I want the relationship, however you define it, as a partnership or bilateral, able to connect to the broader partnership across the AOR, of like-minded nations with shared values.
Great, thank you. Right here.
Hi, my name is Isaac Six. I serve as Director of Advocacy for an international NGO called Open Doors. A quick question that hasn't been touched on, a lot of references to shared values, but to what extent, I'm sure there's concerns on both sides occasionally on human rights issues, both in the bilateral relationship and also in the region. To what extent do conversations about human rights issues, civil liberties come up in these conversations? Is it a factor that's considered? Is it being discussed? Or does it fall outside of the relationships we're talking about here today?
I'll quickly jump on that. It falls outside of my relationship.
When you have a close partnership and engagement, you discuss all aspects that are of interest to both countries. It depends, and a lot of this really depends on which mechanism you're talking about, because today we have multiple mechanisms that provide the framework of that relationship between our two countries. And we have, I've already mentioned some of them in the strategic and security sphere, but you have also mechanisms that are in the realm of foreign ministries. You have within the ministries of Home Affairs, you have a Homeland Security dialogue. You have a dialogue across the board, across the areas of cooperation that we have, and it really shows you how multifaceted that relationship has become. And so, within the relevant frameworks, you do have discussions that encompass issues that are in areas that you mentioned, in areas of human rights, civil liberties, and so on and so forth, and issues that involve rights of immigrants, issues that involve access to each other's as countries, issues that are consular in nature, that involve people that are living in both countries. So there are a wide range of issues that are discussed. And as I said, I mean, when you have a partnership that's this extensive and this close, there's no subject that is not on the table. The other aspect is that the engagement with both Congress and our Parliament also allows for a discussion with representatives of people on issues that are relevant to both countries. And if I were to go and meet Congressman, you discuss every issue that could be of interest to that particular Congressman. And at the same time, I'm sure in our Parliament, in our Foreign Relations Committee of Parliament, there are many issues that are relevant to our relationship that come up, in which we also have a discussion. So as as democracies, I think we have the ability to engage each other in multiple formats and in many ways, formal and informal, that I think contribute to the relationship. I mean, even this particular forum is in some senses an engagement. But if you talk beyond engagements between governments, you also have very, very interesting exchanges that are also relevant and feed ultimately into the decision-making process.
Since I don't see a question, I'm actually going to follow up on the last one very quickly. General Minahan, this is to you. Now, you quickly pivoted off the last question, but I'm going to follow up with you on it. And so human rights, more broadly, perhaps not specifically in Indo-PACOM's lane. However, the importance of good professional military education, is that an opportunity for the U.S. and India to think more about the types of partner capacity building that we could do in the Indo-Pacific region, and as two strong democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, to partner more on professional military education and training for other smaller countries elsewhere in the region.
Yeah, beyond the relationship with the U.S. and India, building partnership capacity is an essential part of regional stability and the Indo-PACOM mission and way forward. So I think that anytime that you get people together in forums where you can openly discuss values and create that interconnectivity, if you will, that does nothing but strengthen strengthen the relationship, strengthen the way you see the challenges, and strengthen the way you handle the challenges. So I don't discount anything you said on that need. We found that there are instances where due to policies that some of those opportunities dwindle, and that the need for those continues, and that when we can get soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines from countries together in a professional environment to build that's a good thing.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think Jeff is telling me that we're about at time. So with that, I would ask all of you to help me thank our panelists for a really excellent discussion this morning.
And a big thanks to you, Lindsay, who I believe recently just moved over from the Asia Society to
the Brookings Institution.
Brookings.
Yes,
Yeah.
Don't even have the cards yet.
Well, I'm sure they're really grateful to have you. She's a rock star on many of these subjects in her own right. And a big thanks to the panel, to General Minahan, to Ambassador Shringla, to Mr. Joshi from ORF. This was a great start to our 2-day event. We're very excited. We're going to take a short, maybe 10-minute break. I thought was a coffee tea break, but apparently has become a water soda break. But if there's anybody who wants to put in a special request for coffee or tea, I'm happy to accommodate. There's a bathroom out there. 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back for some special remarks and our second panel on trade. So thank you all. I'll see you in 10 minutes.
Great.
I was on it for the last 2 nights studying. Yeah, very good. Yeah, keep it updated. Yeah, nice to meet you, sir. I look
I don't know what. It does work right now. I'm not sure because it blinks.
Well, you can't take it out of the auditorium. Did you take it out of the auditorium?
Oh yeah, I did.
Well, that's why it's blinking.
I'm sorry.
So you shouldn't
Now
take
it
it out of the
works. Okay.
auditorium. Are you using it now, or were you
Yeah,
using it
I'm
earlier?
gonna use it after 15 minutes. Yeah.
After 15 minutes after the break?
Yeah, after the break, I'm gonna use it because I'm gonna do my corner. So. The green is on. Yeah.
Welcome back. Can I request you all to settle down? So good morning, and now we will quickly transition into the second segment this morning, where we will have a keynote followed by a panel discussion, an important discussion on the key questions around the future of the trade and economy. But before that, it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote for this conference, the Honorable Member of Parliament, Mr. Manish Tewari, who is someone who's well known to many of you. He's been here on many occasions in different capacities. He has been a union minister. He's been a member of parliament in the UPA 1. And of course, he has also served as the national spokesperson for the Congress Party over a decade. He's closely been associated to ORF until a few years ago. He was part of our advisory group, which helped shape some of our programs on critical issues. And he is also a scholar and a lawyer and has produced interesting pieces on key reforms India must undertake. One of them was on the intelligence reforms that India needs to consider. Currently, he's member of parliament from Shri Anandpur Sahib constituency in Punjab, and the national spokesperson and member of the Standing Committee on Finance of the Indian Parliament. Mr. Manish Tewari, can I request you to speak to us this morning?
Morning, everybody. What Samir forgot to mention was that I'm his permanent understudy when it comes to stand-up comedy. But thank you, Observer Research Foundation and the Heritage Foundation for having this inaugural India on the Hill conference, and thanks for inviting me. It's difficult, really, to characterize the Indo-U.S. relationship, except possibly by using the analogy of a board marriage which has a few extramarital flings here and there. But on the whole, it's been a stable paradigm for the last almost a decade. But this is a story which did not start today. This is a story which actually started 243 years ago, when 13 colonies of the United States of America decided to shake the yoke of British imperialism and declare themselves as an independent nation. And in 1791, when the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution were adopted, they, along with the Constitution itself and the other founding documents of the United States as a country, became the shining city of liberty on that hill, which everybody then looked up to, or has looked up to ever since then. Between 1776 and 1947, the paths of United States and India did not really intersect. The US was busy building a nation based upon the principles of exceptionalism. And India was in the process of possibly conceiving, conceptualizing, launching, and then succeeding in the first non-violent struggle for independence, which the world at that time had possibly seen. But it was in 1941, briefly, when their paths intersected. And that was when President Roosevelt actually got Prime Minister Winston Churchill to agree to something very fundamental in the Atlantic Charter. And let me quote, the third point of that charter said that with respect to the rights of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. And President Roosevelt contextualized that formulation by then later stating in a press conference along with Prime Minister Churchill that I can't believe that we can fight a war against fascist slavery and at the same time not work to free people all over the world from a backward colonial policy. So, in many senses of the word, the push for Indian independence, in addition to being internal, was also extrinsic in terms of the support which it got from the free people of the world, and especially the United States of America. And that process, which began in 1941 with the Atlantic Charter, when Great Britain actually required the United States of America to be able to really even exist as an independent island, finally culminated in 1947 with the independence of India. And we remain grateful to the United States of America for that support, for that push, which not only helped India get its independence, but it also helped in a big way in the liberation of a large number of people across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, who in the 50s and 60s were actually able to throw off the yoke of imperialism and colonialism and emerge as independent nations in their own right. But by the time India got its independence in 1947, the Iron Curtain had already descended across Europe. And the Indian leadership of that time was impressed by the socialistic experiment. And so therefore, as they set about building a new nation which was equitable, which was egalitarian, which would give rights to all, that particular impress or imprint was very reflective in the initial years of our journey as a nation. But however, it is not as if the American influence, and especially the influence of ideas, was missing. Because if you read the debates of the Indian Constituent Assembly, when we sat down as a people to frame a constitution for ourselves, you would see the great ideas of liberty, of equality, which had inspired the journey of the United States of America from 1776 onwards, find reflection in many a debates as we went about conceptualizing articles after articles of our Constitution and giving to ourselves a founding document. And again, the contribution of the United States of America, not only in the realm of ideas to the conceptualization of that document, but subsequently, in the form of the civil rights movement or the great decisions which came out of the U.S. Supreme Court, continued to inspire, continued to guide India as it went from decade to decade in the consolidation of its own journey. The reason why I chose to look back over a period of 243 years is because when you have a relationship which is based upon shared values, when you have a relationship which draws sustenance from common traditions, from yearning to be both independent and responsible for your actions on the global stage, it becomes a far, far more sustainable relationship. It becomes a far, far more equitable relationship. And that's why, despite the estrangement that we may have had between 1947 and 1998 at an official level, at the level of people, the relationship between India and the U.S. was possibly a principal relationship from the point of view of at least the Indian people. And in 1998, ironically, when the second nuclear test took place, that provided an impetus to both official India and to official Washington, D.C., to start re engaging and trying to understand each other better. And that decade between the May of 1998 and the November of 2008, when we signed the Indo-U.S. Civil Nuclear Agreement, was perhaps the finest decade in our relationship going back 70 years. And as I said at the Asia Society yesterday, the one thing that has been missing uh, from 2008 onwards till 2019 is the big idea in the relationship. I think the reason why we've not been able to take the relationship to the next level is conceptually we've not been able to come up with something which could possibly be bold, expansive, imaginative, to step up the relationship beyond the usual exchanges, whether they are in the field of defense technology or the thousands of myriad things which governments do. But there are challenges, and we need to be extremely cognizant of those challenges. And I would just like to list out 4 or 5 of those challenges and possibilities, which I think will play a role in defining the relationship in the medium term. The first is a possibility. And the reason I say possibility is because there may be a coming power transition in Asia. And luckily for both the United States and India, today our objectives with respect to China are actually convergent and our strategies are complementary. Neither the United States nor India seek to contain China or to isolate it. Both nations seek to build a partnership that is resilient enough to give China a pause should it seek to misuse its power. We must jointly continue to persevere. For that, I think, is a critical dimension of the Indo-U.S. trajectory, at least over the next 5 or 7 years or 10 years or maybe even more. The second challenge is, of course, which unfortunately is not going away, is the persistence of violent religious extremism and radicalism, exemplified most clearly by the continuing ISIS threat in the Middle East. Again, this is an area where US and Indian objectives are actually convergent. However, our capacities to cooperate in practical terms are yet to reach their full potential. Neither the United States nor India have been able to come up with good ideas on dealing with very serious challenges to stability in the wider Middle East, which of course has a direct impact on India's own security interests. The recent attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, the incidents in the Straits of Hormuz, Gulf of Oman, and off the coast of the United Arab Emirates in the recent past, and the continuing standoff between US and Iran does not augur well for the region and could set off a wave of instability which could even jeopardize the global balance of power. The US needs to, in conjunction with its traditional allies and new partners, rethink in an enlightened manner its approach to Iran. India shares with the United States a desire for a negotiated solution to the Iranian nuclear imbroglio. What is unclear, however, is whether a solution that satisfies the United States will be equally satisfactory to the wider region, or whether solutions that we declare to be satisfactory because they serve our interests end up nonetheless unknown in the wider region and compelling other states in the vicinity of Iran to pursue their own fallback strategies, which end up making the problem of nuclearization in the Middle East far worse in the years to come. Again, this is not an issue where India has a direct role, but a conversation between the United States and India about the consequences of what an end game in Iran would entail, I think, is long overdue. The third is, of course, the challenge of non-proliferation and the challenge of the provocative use of nuclear deterrence. Both these challenges implicate different actors, especially from the second nuclear age. The challenge of non-proliferation involves Iran, as enunciated above, And the problem of using nuclear deterrence in provocative ways involves Pakistan, whose glide path as a failing state is now even defying gravity and poses a real and present danger to its very survivability. It should worry the world community, for the shrill drumbeat of Pakistani self delusion cannot obfuscate the alarming ground realities of that country any longer. The fourth challenge is Afghanistan and the talks with Taliban. As the US moves through this process, paused for the time being because of continuing violence by the Taliban, it is extremely important that the United States and India consult frequently and transparently because India also has stakes in Afghanistan. And the worst thing that could happen to the bilateral relationship is if India, anticipating the worst, chooses to preempt what might be an evolutionary transformation of the Afghan problem because of choices that India is compelled to make in order to avert dangers that it foresees on the horizon. India is well cognizant of the blood and treasure that the US has expanded in Afghanistan since 2001 and its impatience and exhaustion with the protracted state of affairs in that country. However, what the United States needs to be cognizant of is Afghanistan's reputation as the graveyard of empires. For history, if it repeats itself, would be an unmitigated tragedy, not only for the United States' reputation as the most influential outside balancer of power in every region of the world today, but the progress that has been made by Afghan society since American re-intervention following 9/11. The US has to think through its handling of its impending Amu Darya moment carefully. There's a thin line that separates a negotiated exit from an unconditional surrender. The fifth challenge are the threats to the global commons. Unfortunately, this challenge is manifested most acutely by China again, both with respect to space and with respect to open seas, especially in the Indo-Pacific. The United States has always claimed, and we heard that repeated ad nauseum in the morning, that it is a Pacific power. It's in the mouth of the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea, that this claim of the US would be tested someday. And here, India, as a counterweight, given its geographical position at the head of the Indian Ocean, would be a key ally. However, partnerships need to be strategic and not transactional. In the geopolitical arena, if relationships, as Mr. Sanjay Joshi rightly pointed out, are going to be calculated in terms of bottom lines alone, then the larger picture tends to get blurred, compelling converging partners to re-energize more time-tested relationships. It would, of course, be important to underscore here that parallel relationships are indeed the essence of strategic autonomy, which has been the cornerstone of Indian foreign policy going back to 1947. The sixth challenge is that the United States is making major shifts in its global economic strategy, moving from the multilateral trading regime that the US built in the post-war period to new partial free trade agreements. As the United States thinks of its own relationship with the global trading system, the idea of how the two countries can reconcile their bilateral strategies, both with respect to their own mutual trade and with respect to trade with third parties, I think remains an issue that is worthy of an extended discussion. There is optimism about some minor progress on some elements of the trade deadlock, but that should not detract from a more focused conversation on the conceptual contours of what the gutting of the existing trade architecture would really imply and the consequences that it would have for the world. Let me end by just saying that the strategic challenges that I have identified or which were outlined in the morning are not challenges that are going to disappear anytime soon. Their very complexity would compel us to find more platforms like the current conference to work together, for only by engaging, and further engaging can we surmount the hazard of becoming estranged democracies again. May I thank the Observer Research Foundation and the Heritage Foundation once again for convening this conference, and I do hope this would become an annual event in their calendars which would bring people and policymakers and the policy community from both countries onto a common platform for a day and a half to think through issues of a mutual and common concern. Thank you very much.
We'll quickly transition to the panel. Let me invite Walter Lohman, Mr. Mohan, Rick Rosso, and Ela Patnaik to join us on stage. And Walter, it's all yours.
How you doing, man?
How are you doing?
Caught you at the perfect moment.
I know. I was trying to choke down a candy bar or something. Oh, pardon my chewing here just for a second, but I know many of you in the audience here, and worked with many of you, and I'm sure many people that are watching by our live stream. I'm Walter Lohman, Director of the Asian Studies Center, or Heritage Foundation. As director, I want to start out first here by recognizing all the hard work that's gone into this program, putting this conference together. First to Jeff Smith, our South Asia fellow, who I'm sure you are also very familiar with. And if you're not familiar with him, you should get familiar with him, because as big a mark as he's making now on the U.S.-India scene in South Asia and the Indo-Pacific scene generally, he's destined to make a much bigger mark. So if you don't know Jeff, and I'd be shocked if you don't, but if you don't know Jeff, you should get to know him, because he's really top rate. Secondly, I want to express appreciation to ORF, especially to Samir Saran and our partners, other partners there, especially Pushan Das, who's been on the spot for organizing this event, having been in that sort of role and situation many times myself in the past, especially in previous lives. I know how nerve-wracking it can be to have to put something together like this. So I want to express some appreciation to the organizers. I also want to recognize the long and productive partnership that we have had with ORF, going back now some 10 years, back to when Lisa Curtis was here as our senior fellow for South Asia. ORF, of course, is kind of promiscuous in the sense it has many partners. I think it's partners with every organization in Washington. We only have a couple on the Indian side, and ORF is really a critical one, and we're so proud of the work that we've been able to do with them over the years. So I just wanted to make a couple of those announcements up front here. But for our next panel, I'm really pleased to be leading the discussion on the economic side of the relationship between the U.S. and India. There's always been tensions in the relationship or issues. I think some of that is structural, sort of inevitable differences we're going to have on the economic side, differences that we need to work through. But I think it's fair to say that the tensions over the last couple of years have reached a level that surprised most watchers of U.S.-India relations. Some of that, as I say, may be inevitable given the differences in our economy, the economies, the politics in both countries, where the consensus and sort of instincts are in India on trade issues. They're different than many people in Washington. And then you have in the U.S. the turn to protectionism and industrial policy and a much more confrontational approach to gaining market access. I think if we're honest, we've got to recognize that that's a really big part of the place where we find ourselves right now. I hope we can get into both the structural issues and the broader economic picture, sort of enveloping U.S.-India economic relations, trade issues. But I hope we can look at some of the trade issues specifically as well in this session. First, we're going to hear from Managing Director of Facebook India, Ajit Mohan. Just a couple of highlights from your bio, which I got from your Facebook profile page. So it should be accurate.
I should have sent you something.
No, that's all right. That's all right. Ajit is a former CEO of a company called Hotstar, an Indian video streaming service. He's educated in the United States at SAIS and UPenn, as well as NTU in Singapore. I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective on these issues. And then we'll hear from Rick Rosso. Rick is no stranger to the Heritage Foundation. In fact, honestly, I don't know anyone in town who knows this set of issues better than Rick. If I ever have a question, he's the first person that pops to mind, somebody I can call to get some advice on
where we are. And the first person I call when you ask me that. So.
There you go. Okay, so it's a virtuous circle here. But Rick is Senior Advisor and Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies at CSIS. Before joining CSIS in 2014, he spent 16 years in a variety of roles focused on U.S.-India economic relations, including at McLarty, New York Life, and the U.S.-India Business Council. Then we'll turn to Rick's guru, Ela Patnaik. Ela is professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She has a long list of professional accomplishments, and so I won't go into all of them. But let me just say that before joining the Institute in 2006, she was economics editor of the India Express, 2004 to 2006. And she's also served intermittently as a visiting scholar at the IMF, I noted in your bio, 2003, 2010, 2013. I think that's a very important credential for this discussion. So with that, why don't we get started? I'll turn it over to Ajit. We'll have 7-8 minutes each, and then we'll try to have a conversation.
Thank you. And thank you to both Heritage and ORF for having me. The last time I was in DC was a year after 9/11. The world looked quite different, and it was 2002, the year leading up to the war in Iraq. And for me, sort of 17 years later, so much has changed, and one of the big things that has changed is on the technology front. And one of the frameworks that I wanted to introduce to this conversation today was a lot of the focus on US-India trade has been on elements of the trade relationship over the last 15 and 20 years. And really the question really is, what are going to be the new elements that will guide the relationship over the next 10, 15, 20 years? If you look at even the current conversation in terms of both the areas where the two governments are aligned, where the two countries are aligned, and the areas where there are disputes, a lot of it is on manufacturing, some of it on services, but not a lot of conversation related to digital. And for me, I think one of the big things that's happened in the last 3 years in India that I'm not sure has really landed in terms of the extent of the transformation of the Indian economy is the massive expansion in access to affordable 4G. First led by Reliance Jio, the telecom company, and then followed by others in the telecom space. And literally in 3 years, Jio launched as a trial service in September of 2016. And literally in 3 years, the number of people who had access to mobile broadband moved from something less than 10 or 15 million to a number that is close to 500 million today. That's a dramatic transformation that's happened in a very short period of time. And in many ways, because it's happened in a very short period of time, it's not clear that the world has kind of understood the extent in which it has already transformed the Indian economy, and in many ways, the opportunity inherent in transforming the economy even further over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Just on that back of the movement from 5 million to 500 million, we have seen an explosion in access to new services. Nearly 8 companies that have crossed more than $1 billion in valuation. Massive interest and excitement in the venture space. But more than all of that, I think what's fundamentally happened, if you look at the world, if you look at the world from an internet economy point of view, there is the US, there is Europe, and in a world where the Chinese internet is closed off to the rest of the world, the third pole is India. So China, of course, is extremely consequential. It has a thriving internet economy, but reality is the model that China has built is quite different from the rest of the world. There is a walled garden, and of course, it has created massive successes that's now being exported outside of China. But for anyone sitting in the US or looking at the internet economy in terms of what is accessible, it's really North America, Europe, and now India. And what's really happening is this kind of scale in terms of access to broadband, where 500 million people have come online, and it's quite conceivable that in a very short period of time, that number could move from 500 million to 1 billion, also means that it is going to throw up fundamentally new models in commerce and payments in terms of how people engage with each other, how people transact. And therefore, the opportunity is pretty dramatic, both for Indian companies, for American companies, but also the opportunity to create models that may actually originate in India. Just the scale of the access to the internet means, and the stage at which the access is happening in terms of the evolution of the Indian economy, means companies will be creating innovation that frankly may not be happening at this pace and with this depth in many other markets. Just to give you an example, one of the services that Facebook owns, WhatsApp, the WhatsApp payments is being built on UPI, which is a very local tech stack built for India. And India is the first market. We're waiting for regulatory approval, but we're hoping WhatsApp payments will be live in India before it goes live in any other market. And it essentially creates a peer-to-peer payment model, the scale of which would not have been seen anywhere else outside of probably China. So that's the other point to make, that not just the pace of the transformation in a short period of time, not just the scale of the investment opportunity available that will come on the back of it, but also that it will create the emergence of new models that will be exciting for both Indian and American companies, and those models may be quite relevant in Latin America and in Africa, and frankly, even in North America and Asia and Europe. So what that means is it kind of raises the question on what does that mean for US-India trade? If fundamentally we're looking at the internet economy powering a lot of the growth over the next 5, 10, 15 years, then what does that mean for the relationship between India and the US? And the one of the big questions that's being negotiated now, which has started as a debate in India, which may not have really shown up on the India-US trade conversation, but will probably be a big part of it over the next 5, 10 years, is how do we think about data? And there's a history of data flows between India and the world, India and the US, that have happened organically, naturally over the last 10, 15 years, both from a consumer lens as well as from business transactions. And yet there is now a very live debate in India in terms of, should we as a country be looking at the learnings from China in terms of all of the success that China has seen? And is there a need to replicate that model in India? Which, at least an interpretation of that would be, let's find a way to build a wall around the internet in India, including limiting and constraining data flows. And I think the real question is, and it's a consequential choice, and there's an argument to be made that India and Indian companies will have some success following that model. I think our belief is that India and Indian companies and India as a country, its interests are served even better by making sure that it remains open, that it creates models where data flows move across India and the US and the world with certain guidelines and rules, of course. There's no question that the ongoing conversation on privacy and how do we protect user data is quite a consequential one. And there are enough models in US and Europe, and frankly, enough depth of thinking in India that could influence that. But the fundamental question is, can US and India construct a model for the world that is centered on the openness, the spirit of entrepreneurship that has served both countries well, and the extent to which it will influence the trade conversation? And in that process, can the two countries create a model for what the new rules of the internet could be for the world that frankly could be an alternative to the framework that China has offered?
Let me ask you something. Maybe it would be a good segue into Rick's comments, but your views on that don't surprise me. It's sort of a new economy approach, and somebody in your position and with your background would obviously see and want to bring people's attention to. But can these old issues, these old things that drive India's economy and trade relations, especially goods exports and imports, can they really be left behind as issues, and do they stand in the way of moving on to the issues that, like you say, will really be driving India's future? And then secondly, is this the kind of advice you're giving the Indian government? That is, lay off some of these issues that put you at odds with the other members of the RCEP and put you at odds with the United States and everyone else, and let's focus on the future. Are you giving the same advice to the Indian government?
Yeah, I think two quick reactions. I think on the first one, for me, this is an addition. I don't think it's a substitution to the to the conversation on manufacturing, export of goods. I think this is just an addition because it recognizes that a lot of the Indian economy will be powered by the internet over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, as it will in the US. And therefore, this is a layer that we need to now start thinking about. So I don't see it as one versus the other. I think on the second front, I think the Indian government has depth in thinking about this. I'm not sure whether they need advice from a company like us, but I think if we were asked that advice, we genuinely feel good in advocating for this position that it's actually good for India. That we are not looking at this from a self-interested lens. I think we would argue that keeping the internet open in India, allowing for data flows with guidelines that are centered on privacy, is the right answer for India. So I would not argue that this is the right answer for America or American tech companies. I think when India has done so much in terms of building the foundation for the internet economy, in terms of just moving access from 0 to 500 million, I think a framework that is centered on openness is the best way to kind of explode growth and entrepreneurship.
And it's certainly, it's a position that certainly sort of dovetails with the United States position generally, that is, on data flows and the enabling that has for the economy. Okay, well, Rick, let us hear from you.
I will touch on boring old goods trade, since that seems to be kind of the driver on where things are at right now. We are in today a moderate intensity trade war. And, with Modi's trip and people talking about the deal, I get a lot of American journalists that don't follow the India beat that call and say, is India the next target? Those of us that are in the trenches, there's already bombs dropping, there's already bullets whizzing by. It's pretty serious, not to the China extent, but pretty serious. And so, here to kind of break things down in a little bit more detail. India did make itself a mark in this fight. Saying that as a friend to India. I think a lot of times when I'm in Delhi, people are quick to chalk this up to the fact that we have a president that has picked a lot of irrational fights on trade. A lot of partners where we have trade surpluses, where they've got low trade barriers and they've been targeted. Don't know why. Others where, it's a valid trade fight. But if you look at the track record, even before President Trump was elected, Prime Minister Modi is the least pro-trade prime minister that India's had since liberalization began. First months in office, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, to adopt a measure that had been approved by the previous government, delayed global implementation of this WTO deal because India wanted a single country carve-out for ag subsidies. You've seen an expansion of compulsory local manufacturing rules. Many were adopted before Modi came in, but expanded in areas like electrical power equipment and steel import substitution rules, even shipping containers. There's a rule now where domestically made shipping containers get priority in being leased by the Indian government. Who knew that one? It's not on the list, but it's something real that's happened there that some company out there in the world is saying, like, I lost my market, You've seen areas, too, that clearly is on the United States list on things like price caps, tariffs. The last two budgets, look at the 2018 budget that India released. 49 product groups where India doubled customs duties. Cars, cosmetics, and a lot of stuff in between. So, it isn't just simply that India is the next in line and we've always had issues and it's another bunch. India has taken more steps to close the market on trade than either the Vajpayee or Prime Minister Singh governments, both of whom I work very closely with. So you do see those steps on trade that are really kind of triggering this. That's fuel that this administration certainly would use. This is not going to be given a pass like it might have been with previous administrations to some extent. And again, it's not to say like Modi has done, and I give him a lot more credit than most analysts, big domestic reforms, coal, oil and gas, GST, bankruptcy, big domestic reforms, huge foreign investment reforms. He made more than 40 positive steps on FDI caps during his 5 years in office, twice the rate of either Vajpayee or Singh in either term. So not saying like it's all bad either, but on trade in particular, on goods trade in particular, you've seen a lot of steps that have really helped to fuel the base of the trade fight that's out there right now. I think when Trump first came in too, and a lot of people tried to say, well, make in India and make America great again, that can work together. And I'm pulling my hair out if I had any. No. These two things do not. It's not going to work. And it took a little while, I think, until the fight really started to gear up. But now you see kind of both sides taking it in earnest. Is there the opportunity for a trade deal when they're there? We've got a lot of small issues. Maybe they can soak up a few of them. The question is, would Modi sign an agreement that is one-sided, where India makes concessions and the United States does not? In the United States, the threshold for things like restoration of GSP, like promising we won't move on immigration or something like that, I think for the United States side, the threshold for putting something on paper is a little bit higher. So I'm fascinated to see what actually transpires in New York or Houston and if they can actually capture a deal, because it can't be just India showing up with a piece of paper that says, yes, we'll do the 10 things, leave us alone. What will the United States put on the table? Because both of us have things we've done and things that we're contemplating doing. I think both sides have mostly been teeing up more arrows than looking for solutions in recent months. Now for the good news on trade. Trade's going great. Get out of D.C. and get out of Delhi, and you're going to find out that U.S.-India trade, goods trade, hit $94 billion in the month that just ended. $94 billion over 12 months. All-time record, up double digits. U.S. exports are up by more than 20% in that period. So somehow we are defying gravity. When you double customs duties, when you slap new duties, 232 tariffs, things like that, revoke GSP, these are real things. I've been in private sector my whole life since I left college. You can't do these things without having an impact on trade. But so far, we're not having an impact on trade. And among our 20 largest trading partners, exports to India grew fastest. So, I do like to keep in mind, and anytime I sit down with my own government interlocutors to say, keep up the pressure. India's doing these things, are real. But at the same time, don't go too far, because a lot of American companies are finding India to be one of the fastest growing export markets in the world right now. So we're defiance of gravity. Now, both of our countries have massive trade deficits, and this is what it's all about. India's not doing this because they hate America. They're doing it because they've got the largest trade deficit in the world of any large economy. Almost 10% of GDP in recent years off and on, anywhere between 7 to 10%. That's the size of India's goods trade deficit. Enormous, blows ours out of the water by orders of magnitude. So they're reacting to something very real. And I know lots of great trade economists that can sit there and tell me, well, you can't look at the imports and exports, there's a deeper way to do it, but no leader in the world does, right? There's the number, imports and exports minus that, and that's what they kind of react to. So, I do think that these deficits, both of us have massive deficits. It's going to take a lot more energy to try to figure out longer term, can we survive as trade partners? Companies sure want it. You see the numbers showing that. I think that's we're sliding down a bit of a steep hill right now in trade ties, at least between our capitals. And so far, nobody's been able to figure out how to get a grip. But for me, I do think in particular, you look at something that we need to start tying our arms around, something big like China's Made in China 2025. That, to me, should be the tie that binds us. If we're not going to do a big trade deal with India that covers everything, China has a strategy right now to destroy global manufacturing and emerging technologies, and we're all going to be eating their lunch if they're successful. Huawei is the pointy edge of the spear that everybody's focused on, but China right now has a plan to drive global adoption of their technologies on medical devices, on robotics, on batteries, that kind of thing. Both the United States and India lost out on solar production and other things like that. There's a whole new wave that's going to hammer our manufacturing sectors over the next 20 years. Maybe we can find some bridges to bear on that. So find something, maybe China 2025, maybe something else. We got to find something that our strategic and our econ communities can agree on is the challenge that we both share and begin working up from there. I'll leave it at that.
I'm a free trade fundamentalist, I have to say. I think there is a way to reconcile Make America Great and Make in India, and it's through the application of the concept of comparative advantage.
Yeah.
Right? Maximize the application of it, and we could make both work. The problem with it is that you take the decisions about which industries, which rent seekers get supported, you take that out of the hands of the government, and that's why politicians are involved in it to begin with, basically.
Well, it's kind of strange, like the sectors that Modi has really kind of put a lot of his effort on in this Made in India campaign. I mean, you look at the initial sectors, and they're talking about semiconductors and IT equipment and that kind of stuff, right? So they're like the sectors where India wants to focus on blocking imports, creating local, like those are the areas that we still want to be good in. The areas that we have, I think the United States has started to give up on of, textiles and things that have went other places. Like India has not applied its mind on how to be dominant in those areas nearly as much as Bangladesh has. So I do agree with you. So far, like both of our leaders, though, they want to dominate the same spaces. But I think you're right. There's a lot of space there where if we were to find some balance.
Right, yeah, interesting.
Okay. Thank you to ORF and the Heritage Foundation for having me here. I'll go back to digital trade after Rick's very interesting assessment of the current situation on goods trade, which is really, really important. Now, today, digital flows, cross-border digital flows, are among the fastest growing cross-border flows in the ever. They're growing faster than flows of goods and services, of labor and capital. So despite the fact that we had these very large capital flows through the post the GFC, today the biggest flows that are emerging are digital flows. We haven't, as economists, we are still struggling with the last century's problems, which is how to make the free flow of goods, services, labor, and capital work, and how to make globalization work in those. And then now suddenly we are faced with this huge new challenge of digital flows, which are really a complex issue. Even if they were not cross-border, actually, even regulating them while trying to grapple with the issues of privacy, security, would still have been a huge challenge. But these challenges are much bigger because these are cross-border flows. I just want to comment, during this on what Rick said about trade in goods and how we are putting restrictions. And I think and I hope that maybe in digital flows as well, our politicians and our leaders are wise enough to maybe do all the right or wrong talk, but not really affect trade flows. As you said, that trade is still booming. Maybe we are defying gravity. So let's hope that happens in the digital space as well. These flows are very, very important. Why? Because they're giving us huge productivity gains. India is one of the biggest gainers, I can certainly say, using WhatsApp, using Gmail. We're certainly seeing huge productivity gains. We have been the beneficiaries of innovations that have happened elsewhere in the world, and we hope to continue to be beneficiaries of these. Companies gain hugely because they can monitor their production chains, they can benefit consumers, provide services based on consumer preferences, research. I mean, the innumerable ways in which we gain. When I, as an Indian academic, look at what the Chinese have compared to what we have, I feel relieved that we haven't actually stopped. While we might be in the danger of, having speed bumps, but we haven't really stopped access to the internet the way the Chinese model, or I think as Ajit said, we're discussing that and asking whether that's a model that we should have, but we haven't gone there yet. Now, actually, many countries, I believe more than 50 countries have put restrictions on data flows. Some have put restrictions on health data flows. So, for example, Australia requires health data to be localized. Others have data localization requirements for tax information. Maybe the US and some European countries do that. Some other countries say that there should be restrictions on data unless the consumer has given consent to use that data, and that it could, not to use, but that it could be taken out of the country. So India has restrictions on payments data and has proposed data localization for data on payments, and that's one big area of concern that has emerged in recent times. Now, there are a number of reasons why such restrictions get proposed. Now, these reasons could be security. Ostensibly, that's the most important reason that is given, that, you hear that surveillance agencies want that they should be able to access information for security reasons. The second set of reasons could be privacy. So without the consent of the customer, you don't want his data to go out. A third set of reasons could be plain and simple mercantilism. I mean, protection. So there's a nascent domestic industry that looks at the Chinese model and thinks, wow, there's this huge market. You often hear this data is oil phrase. So there's this huge market, and it should be domestic industries. And we've seen this movie before. I mean, India used to have domestic companies making cars. Pre-1991, we did not allow foreigners to produce cars in India. We've seen situations where we did not allow imports because it was felt that the market should be captured by domestic companies. So it could be a number of mainly these three reasons why you find restrictions. Now, turning to what would be the interests of India and along with that the US. So as I said, India has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of globalization. And if we are able to work out rules-based systems through which we can address the concerns we might have on privacy, on security, then it would be in India's interest. And we don't need Facebook to tell us that. We know that. We've done all kinds of unilateral trade reforms and liberalization since 91. Rick might get unhappy seeing what happened in the last 5 years, but for those of us who've been looking at the last 25 years, we are certainly much better off than where we were doing unilateral trade reforms. And I think even now, some of the areas in which the restrictions are put are not maybe,
Still below bound rates, not illegal. Yep.
Yeah. So India is going to be a huge beneficiary. But for that, what we need is a partnership. A partnership based on shared values, based on the values of having an open and free digital economy, based on respecting the rights of privacy of the users and the citizens, and based on rule of law. So even if their security agencies require surveillance, it should be based on due process. Now, these are challenges. These are challenges even within an economy. Even if one was not to think of the Indian government and the US government collaborating on building such rules-based systems, even if one was to think of a domestic, just the Indian economy, just the Indian government trying to, while balancing right to privacy, civil liberties, and at the same time giving powers to surveillance agencies for security reasons, it would still be a challenge. I think that these are challenges that we have to face. These are opportunities and challenges that we should, as two countries that have shared values, and based on these principles and democratic principles, we should come together and have a dialogue. My sense is it's not going to be a one-off thing. I completely agree with Samir, who yesterday suggested that we should have a joint proposal for the G20 that on the digital economy. But I think that this is something that we'll have to do on a continuous basis. I mean, while it can start with a working group that comes up with a joint proposal, this century is going to throw up huge challenges, and we'll have differences, and we will diverge and we will converge. But I think in the long term, really, because we have shared values, because we don't want to go the Chinese model way. We certainly don't want to go. I mean, if circumstances are such that hostilities get created, if we stop talking to each other, if we are not communicating well enough, and that results in us doing that, I think it would be a huge tragedy. So we should set up forums, institutionalize them, have platforms. This can be the place to begin, because I think one of the mandates for this session was to identify measures to alleviate tensions and provide a long-term roadmap for a consensus on this, that we could just begin with a dialogue which would be something that would be continuous, where people could bring their concerns back, and that could provide ultimately a rules-based system for cross-border flows for the world. Data flows for the world, and not just for these two countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. You mentioned that over the long term, we will converge and diverge, and the relationship will continue. And I believe that in a lot of United States relationships. In fact, as unpopular as it may be to say, I think it's the same in our relationship with China. It's going to diverge and converge, and it's going to go through cycles over time. The challenge is that we don't get into a shooting war in the process. But on trade issues, if we each pursue very domestically focused protectionist, whatever you want to call it, trade policies, we're really going to diverge much more than we converge. If there's consensus in both of our societies that that the government needs to determine which sectors are most important, and that that's just a recipe for conflict over an extended period of time until we get back to some consensus around liberalization. Because in liberalization, you find convergences, right? Because you can find your natural advantages, and capital can flow to where it is most efficient. I wanted to come back to the issue about, and you talked about it at some length, and maybe Ajit has some thoughts on this too, about finding some common rules around digital trade, sort of forging some agreement on those. And of course, that would be more than just US-India. It would have to involve a much bigger group that maybe US-India could serve as a core of. But what are the forums for us to do that in? You mentioned Samir's reference to the G20, but G20 is a really big thing with big pronouncements, and I don't know that it's going to have the capacity to get down into the nitty-gritty of the issues that are involved. Where is it you would propose that we try to get into the details of that?
So I think the way the world is arranged today is that you have the WTO, where this does not fit, and then we are now, in fact, focusing far more on bilateral treaties or small regional agreements. So this could be a completely new arrangement.
And it doesn't quite work at a bilateral.
Yeah, it doesn't, because it doesn't work in a bilateral way. Yeah.
Well,
So
we did it with Europe. When the first EU privacy directive came out, we signed an agreement that we didn't have to comply fully with European law. We were able to self-certify. I don't remember all the details for it. So the United States did it with Europe with the original privacy directive. I'm sure there's probably somebody in the audience that knows more about this. I fought that back in the day a little bit when India was thinking about some privacy stuff. But there is one example I know of, which I'm not sure exactly how much it overlaps, but a little bit.
yeah, but I'm not sure that WTO is at least today when we think of trade. I mean, it's not even doing services very well. So I don't think that is the platform. And now we're going much further ahead. So perhaps, think of a new platform.
I think the reason G20 was mentioned was it did come up in a fairly material way, cross-border data flows on the previous G20, I think in Japan. So at least, I guess it was a recognition at a global forum for the first time, but I agree that probably it introduces the question of where would this best be negotiated. But, clearly there are some elements of it, I think, that have to be resolved within nation states, some bilateral, and a lot of it, especially when it comes to data flows, which then becomes truly multilateral. But, G20 and Samir's idea in terms of can we orchestrate the G20 in India and the couple of years before that as a mechanism to go deep into the different layers of this does seem like a relevant one.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking less in terms of regulation setting and compliance and that sort of thing than building consensus on the rules. Because, and then it's up to the domestic governments, national governments to implement, right? And to let that guide what they're doing. Because now it seems like it's developing its own momentum. And India has restrictions, and then Vietnam has restrictions, and then that serves as an example to others. So there is a consensus developing organically, and it's not generally a good one.
India doesn't have too many restrictions. I mean, I want to agree with Ila. Maybe I should have flagged my passport as well, Ila. Waived my Indian passport before I made my point. But I agree with her that India doesn't have too many restrictions at the moment. At least my observation was, I think there's a debate going on in terms of a framing of, if we look at the next 15, 20 years, which path should we choose? I think the only place where, for example, if we take data localization, a material one is this payments localization. But in many ways, the payments localization, I think, does follow some of the architecture of payments even from the past. So it's not entirely new. And for example, for us on WhatsApp payments, we are complying with payments localization. We have accepted that we're going ahead and doing it. So I would kind of push back. I think it's a live debate. I don't think there are too many restrictions that have been placed at the moment.
So, that's why, if I may come in here to your question, India-US is a good place to start. So to start this discussion on, because both have shared concerns about privacy and surveillance. And because India hasn't yet started, we've only begun discussing it. It is a good place to start, which perhaps will not be the case if you bring in many other countries where, if you bring in China. So, right?
Well, yeah, that wouldn't be the first place to start. That's for
Well, I mean, from India's perspective too, I mean, they'd want to come to the table on this because, I mean, of the $100 billion IT industry, 85% of the exports come to the United States. So there's a natural complementarity on the two of us. From India's vantage point, I think from U.S. vantage point, would we start with India if we could pick the world in any country? Maybe not, but that's the energy and effort that folks like us on the India beat have to compel this down.
And for service exports, this is critical. And while India has this huge trade deficit in terms of goods, but India is a huge service exporter. So for data flows are critical for service exports for India. So this would be a very good place to start.
Right. There's also a connection to goods exports ultimately, because you've got to have the goods shipped when you buy them on Amazon or wherever they're coming from someplace, and they're also serviced, as we know from call centers and the back office processing, that sort of thing. But I wanted to focus back again on the old-fashioned goods trade. So there's been a little bit of discussion over the last year or so over the nature of new tariffs that the Indians have imposed on imports. And I'm asking Rick this. Obviously, anyone can chime in, but I'm asking Rick in particular because he is focused on goods to a large degree. How much is India bumping up against its WTO commitments, its ITA commitments? Because I think there's a good case to be made that at least on ITA, it's in violation. But I know a lot of Indian commentators and Indian government often say no.
Yeah.
So how do you see?
A lot of the tariff hikes have been within the bound rates in the WTO. There have been some challenges, particularly, goods that when the ITA was created, your phone did one thing and your computer did another thing. And when you got the blending, like what's right and what's wrong, is it a computer equipment or is it a phone? So there's some areas of blending that India's tried to say it's not really what was envisioned under the ITA. And there's another product list, which I haven't seen, but was announced this year in the budget, where India announced whole hog that all these IT products that had zero customs duty were India now manufacturers. The finance minister announced that they would begin putting tariffs on those products too. So what all that encompasses, I don't know if there's actually been a list of those things released, but I read that in the budget speech and I'm just like, oh, this could open up. Things are not getting better when you announce that, you're going to start hiking on all these other areas. So there have been some challenges. I think India defends itself saying that it's a lot of products that merged together, and it's tough to say whether it was what was considered under ITA or is it something new because you brought two things together. And then the other shoe to drop is this announcement in this most recent budget. What's going to be covered under this blanket that anything India produces on IT would be subject. But by and large, if you're looking for product lines too, mostly it's the things that India imports pretty heavily. This is where the onion gets a little bit tougher to unpack because, it is the trade deficit with China, which is equivalent to about 3% of India's GDP. That's the trade deficit with one single country. And, some of what is produced in China and exported to India, too, is made by American companies. So if they say, well, ultimately this is a China move, but it still impacts American firms. So that's where things get a little bit tougher to unpack.
I want to open it up to questions, and I have a few always, but so I'm ready to go unless we have some. So we have right in the front here.
Thank you, Ridhika from Indian Chambers. I have one comment and two questions, if I may. Just talking about the data issue, I think where the government of India is right now is in a place where it's different from China, where both the regulator and the regulator are talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do because it's a new space, which is a very comfortable thing for somebody like me. But what the other thing, and I have a copyright on this statement, the other thing that I say is that, yeah, data is the new oil, but oil also gets exported and imported. One doesn't sit on it all the time, right? To figure out, Saudi Arabia wouldn't sit on it and say, we have it, so we'll do what we need to do with it. So that needs to sort of move. And I think that we are in a place in India where they're talking about how to make sure that it's taken full advantage of rather than just sitting on it. But the question is more on, and I'm being a devil's advocate, Ajit, what if the government of India gets influenced by the French way and starts taxing on revenue rather than sales on tech companies? What would happen then? And the question to Rick is, you said trade has grown, but why? Does China have to do something with it? I think no, but what's your view on it?
I'll go first. I think just as a reaction to the first one, and it's interesting how the data is like oil. I think it's a metaphor. Has kind of moved around a fair bit. Last week we had Nick Clegg, who's the head of our policy, global policy in India, and his alternative that he offered was data is like water. Um, and the point was that it's not the value in itself. It is what are the services and algorithms that you build on top of it that add value. So I think the I agree with you about so long as it's mobile and it can flow freely, then it doesn't matter what the metaphor is. Yeah, but I think fundamentally it is there value in itself, or do you allow it to create value for everyone across boundaries? I don't know, to your question on taxing revenues, I mean, I imagine that question can be asked not just for tech, but across the board. I'm not a tax expert, but I would kind of frame it as a more broader debate that now 15 or 20 years into this first wave of technological innovation, everyone, including governments and regulators, are now getting their head around how do you change the rules that were framed for a very different world. That could apply to taxation, it could apply to trade. And I think generally, at least what I observe sitting inside Facebook and seeing other tech companies is, I think tech companies are recognizing that that conversation with the government needs to happen actively. That it's and I'm not talking about tax, but in general, that it's fair to now start navigating what the new rules of the internet should be, because a lot of those rules were designed for an economy that looks quite different from where we are today, not just in India, but around the world.
If we're taking a vote on metaphors, I like water a lot better than oil. Oil seems kind of dangerous. None of them are going to be perfect, but water sounds much better to me. Rick, do you want to take the second part of that?
Yeah, well, let me just follow up too on Ajit's comment. For the young folks in the room that are looking to get deeper in India policy space, spend a little time learning what cross-border taxation looks like too, because huge issues. I mean, Ritika's question is fantastic there. I find that time I spent working on cross-border tax issues back when the first bilateral cases started to come up has served me extremely well in my career ever since then, because it's one of those areas that it's just a little more technical than most of the DC policy wonks like to jump into. But if you can understand what transfer pricing, permanent establishment, the mutual agreement procedure, to get some of these things rolling off the tip of your tongue, opens up a whole new area. And when you sit down and talk to companies and you can talk about cross-border tax issues to them, eyes light up like nothing else that we've talked about up here. Not tariffs, not privacy, not data. So anyways, just a little bit of tip there. Tax stuff, good stuff for people's career development. On trade, it's a great question, Ritika. I did say defying gravity, all these new customs duties, import things, import substitution, the United States imposing tariffs, removing tariff packages, and yet trade is growing. But, some of that is just because we're two of the largest, fastest growing large economies in the world. So all boats rise in that scenario. But in particular, the United States has benefited from strategic choices India's made to buy from America. Oil and gas, defense equipment. Those are two areas where in the last couple of years we've seen, a pretty big bump. So is this the kind of deal that we want to make? Increase customs duties, hurt a lot of American companies in different areas, make it tougher for car companies and cosmetics and IT and telecom companies. But India will directly buy from the United States in these strategic areas. Well, clearly it's not working, So, making those choices while you're making the market a little bit more tougher for other companies. So all boats kind of rise. Specific bumps in petroleum and gas and defense material, but making those choices to buy strategically in a couple of sectors to offset potential limitations in trade in other areas doesn't seem to be winning a lot of favor for Delhi in the current environment.
Tanvi, right down in front.
Tanvi Madan from Brookings. I have a couple of questions. One kind of follows up on Ridika's, and Ela and Ajit, maybe to you and Rick, if you'd like to answer it as well, which is we've heard a lot about, India would like to take advantage of the US-China trade war on both sides, from both sides. We've seen some from the Chinese side giving more kind of market access to agricultural products, etc. But what does India need to do to really take advantage of the US-China trade war? And the second question is slightly more philosophical, which is about how reconcilable kind of India and the US's interests are in the economic space, given the mood the countries, or at least the governments, seem to be in on both sides, which is, I was struck by Prime Minister Modi's Independence Day speech, where he said, we need to export more, but then he says to Indian consumers, you need to buy Indian. And that strikes me as the global mood these days. Everybody wants to export more and everybody wants to import less. And as Walter was pointing out, that's not exactly how the system, and as Ela pointed out, not just India, everybody's benefited from. It doesn't quite work. And sometimes that strikes me as, well, that's because the beneficiaries of globalization within countries have been kind of different. And that's really the jobs question, et cetera. So is this really reconcilable, and which kind of baskets of issues that are on the table that are part of this moderate intensity trade war that Rick talked about, are they very kind of reconcilable? Are things in the basket of not irreconcilable? And some that you'd have to kind of have some give and take, given this mood that the countries are in right now?
What would India have to do to take advantage of the US-China trade war? I mean, so many things. I mean, taxation, infrastructure, get rid of a lot of license Raj, a lot of capital controls. I mean, there's a list of things. Yes, we can if we do all those things, but then the question is, can we do all those things? They have been on our economic reforms agenda for 25 years. We're trying. We've done a few of them. I'm not saying there's no progress, but things go slow, steady, maybe not so steady, but at least slow. And we those of us who follow the reforms process in India have days when we are, we think everything's great, and then days where we're just very gloomy. So it will take, a lot of hard work. Now, on the global mood, unfortunately, the mood of protectionism is, there everywhere to be seen. But I think the only way it's reconcilable is if there were no China. So most of the mood, I mean, while yes, there are tariffs India is imposing on products from the US, but most of the mood, most of the sense, and I'm giving more of not just the $50 billion trade deficit that India has with China, but also the sense that people have, oh, these plastic products, cheap plastic products are filling all retail shops in India. And, those are things that could have been made in India. So most of that mood is coming from the sense that Chinese products are flooding markets. So unless, you have China out, you're absolutely right. These are not reconcilable.
Too, when we think about the India's economic slowdown and the need for reforms, we a lot of times we sort of pin this on Modi. Did he do the things that are on the list that everybody's been talking about? But the slowdown, there's 29 people we should be focused on, even more than Modi. 29 chief ministers. The business environment is driven more by these folks than it is by anything in Delhi. You have access to electricity, healthcare, the business licenses, 75% of your business licenses. The door knocks you get that slow down production because somebody wants a payout is done by state agencies. It's not done by the federal government. So a lot of the work that India has got to do to create a better manufacturing environment has got to be done by the state chief ministers. You saw some early work in the Modi government in doing that in more powerful ways than I thought were imaginable, this Business Reform Action Plan. And, you saw the first iteration of it. A few states were at 70%. Most states were at like 30% of meeting the threshold. But by version 3, every state was at 95% or higher. So they clearly did not set a terribly high threshold, and they also focused on state self-reporting, holding states' feet to the fire to get them to do better. I mean, right now, if anybody's watching the self-destruction of Andhra Pradesh, a state election tearing up every contract for building a new capital city, every power contract that's been signed recently, you see things like that. What's happening in Andhra and things like that happening in other states? You know, if that stuff stops, and if the central government and international institutions pay more attention on getting states to do better, if you saw 6 or 7 states really trying harder to win business, you'd see the turnaround immediately. Because you're investing in Gujarat, you're not investing in India. You're investing in UP, you're investing in Bihar, you're not investing in India. And how is UP compared to Thailand? Is a more valid question than India to Thailand. So there's a few other folks too that I think need to start pulling at the oars a little bit in India. And I'd like to see it happen. And there's some great ones that are doing it. There's some great ones that are doing it. You know, Telangana's got a good record. Vasundhara Raje did some great things during her recent tenure in Rajasthan. You know, you saw Naidu again. Qatar and Haryana, you know, labor reforms, land reforms, stuff that Delhi can't do. So there are some winners. You need to get a few more.
I think that if I add to those, one observation is, even as you know, there's a bit of a gloom and doom in this. I have to say, even for a company like ours, we have had the ability to build our service over the last few years without too many constraints. So I do want to call that out. That while there is concerns that are future oriented, when you listen to some of the debates, the reality of the moment is a lot of tech companies, including us, we're doing really well. So I do want to kind of separate, and I guess it goes to the point that you were mentioning about the reality of the trade. I think Ela's point earlier, I know there's always a strand of gloom and doom. I feel like this has been an ongoing conversation for hundreds of years. But I think the reality of it is actually quite positive, and that's what we are seeing on the ground. The other one is, I do wonder that there seems to be a lot of white spaces for both the India and the US to kind of explode together that is linked to the digital economy. I know we can very quickly get into cliche territory, but I think with just the scale of the people online, the reality is, and this is a hypothesis, that some of the difficult conversations can be on stuff that drove our trade in the last 15, 20, 30 years. But there is such unexplored territory where, because there is, you know, the opportunities are yet to be grabbed, that may orient the conversation towards a more positive manner, which I don't think is currently happening. And for me, again, circling back to, I'm not sure the extent of the transformation in the Indian economy, because it's happened in a very short period of time. I don't get the sense that it has landed in DC and in capitals around the world about the scale of the opportunity that it provides. And I think one of the answers is to orient a lot more to the future where the terrain is yet to be explored.
Thanks. Actually, with regard to the U.S.-China trade war, I'm actually hoping for an end to it. So I hope it's not around much longer for us to seek ways to take advantage of it. And in fact, I would imagine from a business perspective in India, to your question, that's part of the uncertainty you have to calculate, because those advantages, so to speak, if you think of them that way, may not be there at the end of the year, and the next year, who knows how the U.S.-China relationship develops. I'm not sure you can bank on them, even if that were your intention. Other questions? Yeah, right here.
You alluded earlier trade as being a comparative advantage, and there are, of course, even though there is a net benefit to both the partners, there are always losers and winners. So my question here to Ajit is that Indian IT firms have been beneficiaries all this time of trade. And so how much do you think you are obligated to influence the Indian government, that if they are putting protections in goods trade, that it would hurt you because your counterpart there is going to put protection on what you are exporting? That's first question. The second one is, you said that there is a lot of potential now. There will be a lot of innovation, especially in services and all. IT companies so far have been, in Indian IT companies have mostly been providing, for the lack of any other term, I mean, and I shouldn't say it, but it's body shopping. It's basically raw talent of people. They have not created as many services or service products as such. So can you sort of shed some light about how you see the next generation of innovation in service products that would come out of India?
Sure. I think on the first one, my observation is there are enough public processes involving the government and including industry associations, where there are enough conversations between the government and industry associations where this dialogue is ongoing. So I don't see a need to kind of overtly introduce, it almost sounded almost a thread-based framework into the discussion. I think our observation is the conversations are very thoughtful. It's detailed. There's a lot of openness to points of view from the private sector. And there are enough fora where these conversations are happening. And we participate in it like other tech companies and those in the private sector. So I feel very comfortable that there's an open dialogue happening. I think on the second one, in terms of what could those sources of innovation be, let me just take one. In a world where, let's say, WhatsApp payments comes alive, and I think Ela described that there are businesses who are already engaging on WhatsApp, small enterprises as well as large companies, even though today, for example, WhatsApp itself hasn't created a product framework to enable it. And yet, it's being used, for example, to push discovery of products. I can imagine a world in which if WhatsApp payments comes alive, it could fundamentally change both the model of peer-to-peer payments as well as the larger agenda of financial inclusion in the country. And it could completely create new commerce models, messaging-based commerce models, where those models may be coming out of India, and that model could be exported in other parts of the world. Just as an example, one of the companies that we invested in was a company called Meesho, which fundamentally is people advocating for products to their friends and family on WhatsApp, with the sale happening between people, including the price, and this company essentially acting as a fulfillment arm on the back end. Now, these are all models that are only showing up because of the scale of the popularity of the messaging platform. And you can imagine the minute you add payments to it, it can really fuel commerce models that the world hasn't seen before. So I think that's just an example that the minute you kind of look at 400, 500 million people online, and the minute they are connected in multiple ways, and you add financial flows into it, you're in a terrain that the world hasn't seen before. So that was a very specific example for you in terms of what that innovation could mean. That's a model that could come out of India that could be exported to the world.
Anything on the other?
The next big challenge is going to be Libra. So,
topic of an entirely different conference, I think.
But a place to start talking, because we know we're going to face it soon enough.
Let me ask you something, since we talked about China just a moment ago. Maybe it's because of the people I speak to in Delhi and Indian friends here, people, analysts or people associated with the government. I was hearing quite an aggressive take on China, and it extends to econ. It's a lot of griping about the trade deficit and other sorts of things, and how the U.S. and India should be working together on the econ side, and even the idea that the U.S. should help India become market leaders in certain sectors in order to counter the Chinese, et cetera. So there's this very aggressive attitude on the one hand. On the other, you're engaged in a very complex set of negotiations on a trade agreement with China in the RCEP. So which is it? So do you want to be partners with China through the RCEP, or do you want to confront China as some sort of mercantilist power. And does that conflict have something to do with the fact that RCEP is now in its 7th year of negotiation and 26, 27 rounds? Because India at this point seems to be the principal obstacle from the negotiators reaching agreement.
They announced it'll be done next year, so we're good with that one.
Similar to every other year in the last 7 years. Yeah. Right.
I was 7 years old the first time.
So how should we see China? And maybe if you've got some perspective on it, specifically India's involvement in RCEP. I mean, why be a part of that if you have this divided mind about dealing with China?
It's a complex relationship with China. I think it was in the first panel also this was talked about, that China is a partner. It's not that we are going to stop trading with China. We're going to say we have a trade embargo. We're not going to talk to you anymore. No, that's not going to happen. And, it goes beyond, China, we have a border with China. We have trade with China. We can get unhappy. We'll gripe. I mean, that's a right. But I don't think that we are going to go into it treating China as an enemy. So, whereas, with Pakistan, we kind of stop trade, we stop the bus, we stop. Whereas with China, it's a growing, deepening trade relationship, which, we might try to bend to our advantage, try to bend it to our advantage, but not to stop it. And if you look at investment flows from China, they're also big. They saw companies investing in startups in India in many sectors. So it's not going to be something that is a relationship that will be simple or a binary yes or a no.
But can you reach a trade agreement with China? I mean, the news that I heard coming out of Bangkok the last meeting was that most of the other partners were begging India to please give some ground so that they could finally come to agreement. And it doesn't seem like India's there yet. I mean, you could blame the impasse on the Chinese just as well, because you have problems and there's two sides of each issue. But so I see what you're saying, that it's not a binary choice and you're not trying to shut off China, but on the sort of upside of it, can you reach a trade agreement with China?
Let's reach a trade agreement with the U.S. next week, and then we can see.
Okay, I'm going to get to that in a moment.
Yeah, blocking imports from China is a tier 1 policy priority. Trade agreements are not. So I don't think a substantive agreement in RCEP, I don't think it'll happen. They may sign an agreement if all members agree to water it down. Opening up the floodgates more, unless you have a change in government.
Isn't that an argument for the others to not invite you to the next round and say, okay, it's fine, in a nice way.
I'm sure you have these same conversations, Walter. A lot of the other members,
yeah,
privately, they agree.
Yeah.
They're a little nervous about it too. I mean, most already have decent market access, irrespective of a deal. But, I wonder, this is supposition, whether the others are kind of thankful maybe in some ways that they're not getting bigger access. China's not getting bigger. So my word's not theirs, but there may be others that share India's concern. Could be.
But in the case of ASEAN, they already have an agreement. And in the case of some of the others too, they have agreement with China, Australians and the Koreans.
But they're also, like a lot of these other negotiators too, they really do want access to the Indian market, so getting them in,
That's true.
so.
That's where a huge amount of the value comes.
Yeah.
Comes from the agreement. I did want to, let's get another question. Then I do have one I want to make sure we have time for.
I just want to add to what Ela said. India has now become the battleground for US and China on technology investments. The amount of portfolio investments done by China in Indian tech startups is much more than what the American direct technology companies' investments is in India. So I don't think we need to choose between, or we don't have to have an FTA with China to get that trade sorted out. It's not like how this country wants to make sure that there should be an FTA and then everything will be perfectly rainbow scenario. That's not the case with China. And I agree with what Rick said. Probably the other RCEP members are sort of thanking India because we are just not bending backwards to make sure that if China gets access to the Indian market for goods and products, India does get access to the service industry for the rest of the RCEP members. And that's something that India is not backing it down on. So I agree with you.
I mean, I got to admit, I doubt that a little bit. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't some members, But I think that have reservations. But I think if you're a member of the negotiations, it would be appropriate, given all that everyone's just said, it would be appropriate for you to ask India to leave the negotiations. I mean, if you're involved in a negotiation where you never intend to reach agreement, what the hell are you doing? Except blocking it. And maybe you're right. Maybe there are a country here or there that would rather see it blocked, but so many of them already have a trade agreement with China. I mean, most of them
Honestly,
already
like I said,
have
Walter,
trade
most of the conversations I've got negotiating partners, they won't do that because they do want India in. They want
Yes,
access
no,
to that
that-
market. So I wasn't trying to say a majority are behind,
yeah.
but there are some that I just wonder, but
Well, that's true. That's the other part. That's the other part of
India, yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. Yeah. That's certainly true. That's certainly true. Okay, the one thing I wanted to make sure we got to was discuss in a little bit more detail is the prospects of an agreement. That's Ela just referenced that, prospects of agreement in New York and what might be included in it. In addition to, I guess, the many issues that sort of led to the impasse over the negotiations in the spring, medical devices and the rest, the list of issues on the U.S. side. There's also the Indian retaliation for the iron and aluminum tariffs, and there's the prospect of a 301 investigation that the administration has left out there. So what are the prospects, and what is the range of possibilities, including some of those issues you don't hear much mentioned in the context of the talks?
Well, I think some of the things that are on the U.S. agenda, India could move on without breaking the political bank back home. They've already offered a basic model on how they could change this price caps on price controls on medical devices, offering graduated increases at every stage, of distribution. Heavy motorcycles, we all know there's not a lot of production in India domestically, and that's something that the president personally, cares about. There's a wide range of areas in agriculture that India's got different types of import regulations that have impaired American companies, not just dairy. So maybe a few nodules here and there on those kind of things. So I think there's a few that, India wouldn't, I think, cause a lot of domestic pain to do. But again, as I sort of mentioned in my opening, the bigger question in me is like, would India ever sign a one-sided agreement where they make all these concessions and the United States offers nothing? So what would the United States put in comparison with what I think is a level of contributions to an agreement that India could make? Would the United States agree not to take away this spouse worker thing that the president's got control of for H-1B workers? Would we talk about not doing 301 for sure? We promise we won't do 301. Would they restore GSP? That's a pretty high threshold, I think, to be able to do. So I'm a little more puzzled about what the United States is willing to put. We focused a lot on the Indian agenda. We know what India would like to see from the United States. Take them out of the next round of 232 if it happens on auto components, things like that. Visas, immigration, GSP restoration. Like, we know what the limit, the universe is. But what is the United States willing to do? I think it's a little trickier. So I just can't wait to see, if they release a document. I figured it's got to have some two-way. The U.S. agenda and what we're willing to put on paper, I think, is a little tougher to guess than the Indian side.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common theme across our negotiations currently going on. It's a mysterious sort of negotiating style, I would say. I get everything and you don't get anything, except I won't hurt you anymore.
Yeah.
And that's like.
But that's a step in the right direction. I mean, if they come to agree and they at least put a pause, because as of a month ago, both sides felt like they're teeing up more arrows to shoot at each other. So it's a good step if they are able to finalize and come to something.
And you think some of these, well, you mentioned the 301, sort of refraining from that could be on the table. And also, do you think the steel and aluminum tariffs and the retaliation are also part of that?
Yeah, we all know what the items are in the mix, but nobody at the table has, I think, stated what they think a package could look like. So we're just kind of guessing, because on both sides, you got a half dozen or so issues that we know have been kind of the main points of contention. But what they're able to cobble together, and I gather talks are still underway, so they don't know either how much they're going to be able to put on the table.
But coming from you, because you do know this stuff and you follow it more closely than anyone, or as much as anyone in town, given what you said, it would imply that we're not on the cusp of an agreement. Because if it's still all that uncertain, how do we get to yes next week?
Well, anybody that's been involved in negotiations, nuclear agreement, everything else, I mean, there are always negotiators at the table until the heads of state walk in the door trying to get initials on point 11 on page 75. So I'm not worried that it's not done yet. I'm not worried about that at all. The biggest things we've done for the most part are still under negotiation until they come in. And sometimes somebody's asked to block the door for a minute so they get 5 extra minutes, you know.
I was gonna say, I thought you were going to say until the last minute when the president walks in and tears up the agreement. Not that that hasn't happened before, but at any rate, I want to thank you all for what has been a really terrific discussion. Thank you, and maybe you all can join me in thanking them as well.
This thing about never having served in government.
Yeah, that's terrific.
Walter, thank you very much. Ajit, Rick, you guys were really great. You know, I've been watching U.S.-India relations for a long time, and I learned a great deal, not only from this panel, but from all the speakers today. So I want to thank our first panel as well. I want to thank Manish Tewari. I want to thank Representative Yoho. This was precisely the type of discussion, the quality of discussion that we envisioned when Samir and I talked about putting this conference together last year. And this is just the type of spirit and type of discussion that I hope we have moving into tomorrow as well, when we'll have Representative Scott Perry give an address. We're going to have a panel on geotech, including our own Klon Kitchen. And I'll be participating in a panel tomorrow late morning where we cover some of the trickier third-party relationships that impact India-U.S. relations, including Iran, including Russia, and others. So with that, thank you all for coming out today. Some of you will be coming to lunch in Van Andel. There are sandwiches outside for the larger group, and we're excited to kick things off tomorrow morning. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. I've learned so much of these things.
A couple of us heard last night.